All right, so this is our first session on The Unknown God by Deirdre Carabine. We were just talking about before we started the recording that a little bit of her life and times, which I looked up because I was curious. She's still around, she's in her 50s. She's working as a university administrator in Uganda, of all places, at a university she helped found. I think it was originally founded as a Catholic university, although it takes people of all kinds. So she got her PhD in Ireland, I guess back in the 80s or something. And now she's running a university in Uganda. Just a little bit of background on her. I mean, the reason we're reading her is because she's a careful scholar that's good on this whole topic, not because she's any, big major philosophical thinker herself. She's just a careful student who learned all this history and can lay it all out for us. So that's just a little bit of background on her. Apparently she goes by D, so we can call her D for short if we need to. Anyway, that's just a little bit of background looking her up. And then a word or two on the how we're going to do this book. We can do this in like 3 or 4 sessions. We assigned about 100 pages this time. If we did the same rate, we'd get through it in 3 sessions. But there's some natural divisions we could take 4. We can get your feedback toward the end about how fast we're going through it and whether or not we want to have 3 sessions or 4 sessions. I did everything before Plotinus on the last one because I wanted to give Plotinus his own session, basically, for Neoplatonism as opposed to Middle Platonism and earlier Platonism. So you can treat Neoplatonism as its own thing. But next time we could just do Neoplatonism. We could also do Philo of Alexandria, who's the first person in the second section and the only one in the second section who is a Jewish rather than Christian thinker. So if we want to do 3, we would do Plotinus and Philo next time. Plotinus, Neoplatonism, and Philo next time, and then all the Christians on the 4th one. Or we could do just Neoplatonism next time, and then do like Philo, Gregory of Nyssa, maybe Augustine as the first Christian section, and have a second Christian section on Pseudo-Dionysius, Scottish Eriugena, and wrapping up kind of things. That's if we want 3 or 4, but we can decide that as we see how far we get through this stuff we already have. I hope people got the different assignments besides the 100 pages or so of this book. I also suggested the first hypothesis of this, which is a very short section. I don't know if everyone got to read that, but it's basically 10 pages of an obscure Platonic dialogue, basically. And the reason to assign that is because it gets made something of already in the early Platonists and Middle Platonists, and it made a lot of in the later Platonists. So Proclus is probably the last of the Neoplatonists. This is a book by Proclus. It's just his commentary on that one dialogue. And it's, so they made a lot out of that dialogue. The Neoplatonists, I mean, but that's mostly for next time. But I just wanted to lay that as groundwork so that we have some basis in the actual texts in Plato that they're all talking about here when they talk about Platonism. Anyway, that's just some preliminaries on the reading and so forth, and how we might go through all of it. One other thing I wanted to mention here about this book, it's one of the things that you get from a scholar rather than original writer. Original writer will often, give you only their thoughts on things. There'll be someone they're, debating whatever. Someone like this instead is very good for learning what other books you might read, right? She has a good bibliography in the back. You look at her footnotes. The names she mentioned can send you to the primary text about those people. Of the secondary people she mentions, probably the 2 that are most worth looking at besides herself, if you want even more secondary stuff on these things, are, let me get this right. Mortley, that's the From Word to Silence in 2 volumes, and then A.H. Armstrong, who is like The Escape of the One and a few other essays like that, and is also, the blurb right around the back of the book, who's like pretty clearly the scholar before her in the same tradition, who she's sort of a student that we're following in the wake of. Anyway, that's just one of the other uses of a scholar is they point you to other things to read if you're interested. All right, that's my just overview background before we get to not even first impressions, but just did everybody get the reading, manage to do the reading? Any previous familiarity with the topic? I should also mention before that one of the reasons we're doing this, several reasons we're doing this, I think everybody here already knows this, but because the closing part of the Gnostic religion book we read last time was all pointing to the unknown God, and Chuck asked the question of what Platonism should you know for the main line of influence on Christianity, and that's kind of what we're getting in the first half of this and the second half of this. Admittedly, only with a certain lens. We're not getting all the ways that Platonism influenced the Christian tradition. We're only getting its influence on negative theology specifically. There's other ways that influence people like Clement of Alexandria or Augustine in ways beyond what's gone to do here. She doesn't mention Origen here at all, but he's another place where there's a definite contact between Platonism or Neoplatonism and Christian tradition. I think she mentions Origen in here only as a critic of Celsus, who she does talk about as a sort of late Middle Platonist. Okay, so that's just background on why I'm reading this. I want to ask around the table the usual questions of did you do the reading and so forth, and any previous familiarity with the topics beyond like just having read Plato or something. Joe, you want to start us off?
Yes, I am probably the least well read among us of the background material. So I was quite interested in following the track of from beginning at Plato and with his origin in the Parmenides dialogue, because I had not heard of any of the people in between, except maybe as they might have been mentioned in Jonas and encountered occasionally. Plotinus' name was much more familiar, but
yep.
I never figured out what his role played, because he seemed to be just a middle figure in many essays or many things I've read between Augustine and the Greeks. But I was very interested in the discussion, and I liked the way in which the Neoplatonism began to develop as an attempt to fuse Aristotle with Plato to sort of resolve what might be seen in the minds of those very early philosophers after Aristotle and Plato as being a confusion, because if these two great men understood everything, why did they have any disagreements at all? And so they try to fuse this stuff and figure that out. So I finished the readings. In my usual habitual way, I finished the readings exactly 30 minutes ago. I did get all the way to page 102 in the book, and so I had it all.
Yep.
Very interested in that, and the names that he mentioned, especially in the last two chapters, the guy whose name starts with N and the guy whose name starts with A. Yeah, well, I can't remember names very well, and I can't pronounce those things. Seems to be very influential on Plotinus, and that might be worth go back and looking at them again in the chapter just finished before I actually, or immediately after I've gotten into the Plotinus.
Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
I think I've run out of steam, but oh yes, the one thing about D that I found it very frustrating is that I don't read Greek. I can't even pronounce the word in the Greek with Greek letters, and she never gives you a footnoted translation of what that Greek word meant. And I can't even look up the Greek on Wikipedia or in the internet the way I could look up any of the other terms.
Type the transliteration. Yeah, I got it. No, you're right, and it's a common thing with people who have a lot of language skills, is that they will translate something from a language that they somehow think you don't have, but if they put it in Latin, you get it all. And she also does that to a lesser degree with Greek. Often with the Greek, she'll tell you the Greek and then she'll give you a paraphrase down below, but she won't tell you that it's a translation. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that, leaving little snippets untranslated here. Even long passages when they're in Latin, she'll leave untranslated. Short snippets from Greek, she'll leave untranslated. Any other language, she'll pretty much translate it. She doesn't sprinkle this thing with German and French, as I've seen some people do as well. But yes, it's one of the downsides of being trained as a classic is you think that everybody else could pass the entrance exam for Columbia in 1783, which was to translate an ode of Horace from Latin verse into English verse, and a chapter of Matthew from New Testament Greek into Latin. And you were graded on whether or not you kept the rhyme scheme for the Horace and all that kind of stuff. The point is, people who have classics may assume people have way more languages than they have. But yes,
it's the same today with mathematics, of course.
That's true.
that-
People will, say they'll just make a reference to a scientific theorem or a mathematical relationship, and they'll assume you just get it or will look it up. But I can try to help with some of those, maybe not every single one. But I will definitely talk about apophantic, right, and what that means, and so forth. Yeah, we'll wrestle with them as they come along. But whenever there's a particular one that got in the way of reading comprehension, if you call it out to me, I can see if I can translate it for you. Some of them I have to look up myself, right? But it's a fair question. Chuck?
Well, I did finish all the readings. I did find them, given my church background and being an adult convert to Christianity, a fascinating adventure to realize that Platonists and the Parmenides, at least, were wrestling with some ideas that would reverberate through Christian theology later on, and wrestling with them in a typically Socratic manner, meaning I don't think anything in Chinese approaches this kind of density, this kind of, I guess I would say clarity too, but insofar as the Greek seems to very much turn on changes in language text, it's a type of argumentation that for a person like me with no formal training in philosophy of any kind is very odd. It's no doubt valid. It is no doubt epically useful, but it's very odd for me. I'm much more used to political or historical discussions.
Can I ask a
very
question?
much more.
Quick question. Is that primarily a reaction to the kind of reasoning you saw in the Parmenides part, or to the
Primarily. Yeah.
Okay, yes.
I mean,
No,
D is much more approachable.
That dialogue is famously an outlier within the Platonic corpus. It's incredibly dense and dialectical and full of paradox, and it's characteristically Parmenidean. And we'll talk about what that means, when we get to it. But it's not even characteristic of most Plato. It's an outlier even for Plato. And yes, it can seem strange. Odd is a good word for it. And you always have to ask, what part of the assumptions did the outcome of the argument depend upon, right? What was the premise smuggled in that, the hinge of it, right? And this is the same kind of reasoning you have in mathematics. So if you see that the theorem was proved, but you want to see what was it in the proof that made it go through, because you want to know how much it generalizes or what it depended upon, or what assumption had to be made for it to go through. And this is the reasoning you get in the Parmenides is very much of that kind. It's designed to, for the person who's really on the alert and is tracking all those things, there's going to be way more indirect comment on those sorts of logical dependencies than there is even on the surface of the argument itself, where the interlocutor is just saying, well, I guess so, or I don't see why. Oh, and you point something out to him and says, oh, now I see it, right? Which is like the 12-year-old version of hearing the argument, right? And the reason that you get someone like a Proclus, right, going on at this length about just the first three hypotheses of the Parmenides is because you can read a ton into each of those sort of implications or dependencies. Anyway, but go on. I want to hear your. We're not really doing first impressions yet, really just previous familiarity, but anything about the familiarity with the people that we get to in D, the whole cast of characters from Middle Platonism.
Well, again, not having any formal exposure to philosophy, but having had some exposure to philosophical writers and concepts from my exposure to Christianity. I also found it particularly interesting, and we'll be looking forward to what Dee has to say about Philo in the next section. The possibilities of his being a faithful Jewish believer, marrying Socratic approaches is a fascinating possible interaction to see if it unfolds more in Dee, or if I find it elsewhere that I can look up later on. So
I think it's fair to say Philo is more Platonic than Socratic, and he winds up reading the Old Testament in particular very allegorically. He's kind of an inventor of the allegorical method of reading the Old Testament, in part to try to marry him up to Plato. So if he has a thought that he thinks is metaphysically true from Plato, he'll read a section of the Old Testament as an allegory on that, fact that he'll relate it to. That's the characteristic thing you get in Philo. But Philo is trying to see as little contradiction as possible between the New Testament and the Old Testament and Plato. And there are all kinds of curious strategies involved in that with Philo himself, which we'll get to when we get to Philo. Philo is definitely worth reading. He can be a little bit odd is not quite the right word. He can be a little bit fantastical at times. This looks like a strained reading. It's an interesting strained reading, but it looks like a very strained reading, right? Philo had an interesting thought here. He says he has this interesting thought because he was reading it out of his text. You may suspect that the interesting thought occurred first in the mind of Philo. That sort of thing happens a lot. But he will piously say, "Oh no, I didn't invent any of it. It was all there in the text." But that's just his way. But fine, useful stuff. I do want to get into the whole cast of characters when we get there, all the new places and so forth. But let's get to Craig and did the reading background, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I have to say I beat Joe. I finished reading an hour ago, or an hour before the get together, and I did get through Plato Parmenides, and I thought actually the introduction in this little thing was wonderful. That's one of the best introductions I've seen of a work of Plato in a long time. So also reading the introduction to see how the piece that we were to read fit in with the rest of it was very useful. I shared Joe's frustration with never having had classical Greek, only having had New Testament Greek. So the classical Greek was a pain. I did have Latin, but that was in the 60s. So the Latin was a bit rusty. As far as familiarity with this stuff, yeah, I'm dating myself again because in the 70s, I remember reading a lot of Copleston's works, and there was some coverage in that, but it certainly didn't register the same way. And the way a Jesuit scholar slants things is very different than how Dee has slanted things in her work. So I found that fascinating. But general sense was enjoying the richness of the times, so to speak, in terms of the dialogues that were going on, which is often left out. I know when we had philosophy of religion, we sort of jumped all the way to Aquinas way too quickly, and it really didn't even give Plotinus so much of a chance. So it's nice to go back and get lost in the richness of these arguments that are going on, or discussions that are going on. I also found it interesting as we started reading this book. Just a quick aside, I've been in a number of discussions lately on is consciousness primary kind of arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And when they start discussing consciousness, I'm certainly getting this flashback to negative theology.
Mm-hmm.
So they use the word consciousness instead of God. It's a fascinating sense in which all of the neuroscientists clearly have not had any theology or had any philosophy. So they're using the same shit for arguments that have been done for centuries. So that was
Yes.
that was an interesting little aside in terms of digging into it. That I found fascinating. Is it gives me a little bit more of understanding that there's still babes in the wilderness when it comes to trying to sort all this stuff out.
No, that's fair. There's a lot of stuff in sort of more philosophical or out there bits of, or foundational bits sometimes in science, where they're going over ground that they don't know is really just philosophical ground, and they certainly don't know that that has been plowed many times. And there's lots of other people have already, considered all the arguments they're advancing on it, and you will get, very shallow metaphysical arguments advanced as the latest science.
Exactly.
My favorite example of that probably is Max Tegmark, who is a fun cosmologist in other respects, but when he gets armchair philosopher, he doesn't know that other people have had this thought before. But anyway, just as a consumer of that kind of science, too, sometimes it's glaring, but yeah, but a fair point. And I agree with you about the richness of the tradition really coming out here. Not many people would have spent this much time on the Middle Platonists and gone over the successive positions within them. And part of why she's doing that is because she's trying to establish to what degree there is something new and original and surprising in Neoplatonism in the sense of Plotinus, and to what degree it's in continuity with Plato or in continuity with other Platonists only 100 years before his time as opposed to 500 years before his time. Because it's, if you just jump Plato to Plotinus, it can look like a very stark contrast between them. And you're like, where did all this stuff come from? But there's a whole tissue in between that, honestly, one of the reasons it's often not studied very much is we have most of these people through fragments, have most of these people through comments from others. And if there isn't a solid weighty book you can do a whole semester on, then it never gets assigned anywhere. So Plato you can do, and Aristotle you can do, and Plotinus you can do, but in between, it's you need a Kinko's printout for all the papers, and there's no one textbook, so it tends to not just get glossed over. So that's why these scholars are good. They can get us all of that in appropriate context. Okay, Jim, you're going to have to come off mute to tell us your story.
Yeah, well, I was familiar with some, but I didn't really know much about any of them. Just a few. I mean, well, the references to some of the early church fathers. The Middle Platonists I was really kind of clueless about. As consequently, I have a lot of questions about those individuals, the ones I found most interesting. I loved it. It just seems everything we read, I don't know how it keeps getting better. It's fascinating to how that was filled in. I also like Parmenides. Well, I'd heard this somewhere before. You read it to me. I was like, yes. But that won't get into that. But I think I had fun looking up the Greek and the Latin stuff, so I could understand what the terms meant. I did have a few questions about that because I think one of maybe it was Joe or Chuck had said maybe the New Testament uses the same word, and what's the translation that we should be using there. So I'll have one of those questions. But all in all, I thought it was really fascinating. I can't wait to read the rest of it. I can't wait to discuss it. I hope we have enough time because I got so many thoughts and questions. So I don't want to belabor that because we'll be here for a while. It was. Is there anything else I needed that you wanted to make sure I commented?
No, that's great. That's great. I mean, we'll get the first impressions after, but very useful sort of initial reaction. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about for first impressions, which is just about the something about the structure of this book that it's kind of obvious to me, but maybe not be obvious to everybody else. Just because when these characters are obscure enough, the timeline might not be clear, and you can easily read this book thinking that it's in chronological order, right? But it's only in chronological order in two halves. The first half, the Greek half, under Greek apophasis, right? All of that is in chronological order down to the Neoplatonists. And then when you start on the Christians, we start with Philo, who isn't Christian, he's Jewish, right? And that also is in chronological order. But the two chronological halves are each a millennium long, and they overlap by 500 years, right? So the stuff we've already gotten to in the Middle Platonists, chapter 4, the last chapter we read, is 2nd century Platonism. When they're talking about 2nd century Platonism, they're talking about 2nd century AD Platonism. So this is over 500 years after Plato, right? And that's the precursor to Plotinus, who's basically very beginning of the 200s. But Philo is active in the first half of the 1st century AD, down to like 60 or so, 50 or 60 or so. And then Augustine and Gregory of Nyssa are late 200s and early 300s, sorry, late 300s to 400. And that means that they are earlier than the last chapter on the later Neoplatonics. Proclus dies in 480 AD, right? So this Neoplatonism stuff goes down to almost 500 AD. The stuff in Plotinus is earlier than that, it's in the 200s, but the stuff in chapter 6 that we'll get to eventually, down to Proclus and the sort of last of the classical Neoplatonists who are pagans, not Christians, goes down to 480 AD. And that means that the only ones in the second half that are after them are Pseudo-Dionysius, who's probably early 500s, that's around contemporary with Proclus. And we're not sure about the dating of Pseudo-Dionysius, we'll get to when we get to it. And then Scotus Eriugena is the 850 or so, right? So only the last couple in this one, in the Christian half, are later than the last one in chapter 6. So just understand, these are 2 things a century long, but they're not being divided by chronology, they're being divided by, this is the pagan tradition, this is the biblical tradition, basically. That's why Philo, it goes in the second one, it's not a Christian, it's a biblical half, and they overlap. So by the time we've gotten to the chapter we've gotten to, we're already into that overlap. We've already gotten past the time of Philo, and we haven't quite gotten to the time of Gregory and St. Augustine, but we're close. And by the time we get through the next section, between chapter 5 and chapter 6 is the same transition that gets us to chapter 8 and chapter 9, right? So those things are really running concurrently for the middle 500 years of this whole span. Okay, so just want to make sure that chronologically, don't think this is all, the pagans, and then after the pagans, the Jews and Christians come along. No, they're overlapping. And the time period that we were focusing on with the Gnostics, right, is right around that overlap time, right? The time that's in both of these traditions is that same, critical period from AD 0 to AD 200 or whatever, where the Neoplatonists, the Middle Platonists are becoming Neoplatonists, the Gnostics appear, Christianity launches, all those things are happening in that same 200-year span. Okay, before we do, I want to make sure I got that out there before we get to actual first reactions to things. But we can do first reactions in the other order and start with Jim. You already gave us a little bit of your first reactions with general enthusiasm, but I want to divide your first reactions a little bit. First reactions to the Parmenides stuff, that is Plato's Parmenides stuff, or to the D stuff. Go ahead.
So we'll go Parmenides first. I thought, without getting too deep into it, the big takeaway I got from that, or what I thought the message underneath the message was, and I also wanted to ask where exactly that was referred to in this text. You're not gonna, God's ineffable. I thought the whole exercise was to show that you can't reduce God to language, categories, time, that it seems like that's what the entire argument was around. Every which way you turn, no matter which domain you tried to look in, it was there was not adequate language, there wasn't adequate logic. It was a paradox that would be not a paradox. I was just constantly going back, and I think that the main point that was being communicated is the ineffable nature of, I guess in Plato's sense, would be something that's the good or maybe beyond the good, which I did have a question about that, the elevating of beauty later in the text.
We'll come to beauty and the good, but let's stick with Parmenides, because in Parmenides, he's only talking about the one and maybe being, but he's not yet talking about the good or beauty. Plato will, but
Right.
the Parmenides doesn't. In terms of where it comes up in the text, it's very early in things down to like page 17. She talks about it in terms of actual historical Parmenides before Plato, and then it comes up again way off in the Platonist chapter, which you haven't gotten to yet, chapter 5. We're about to start next.
So you're right.
And, go ahead.
Yeah, that's one of those things I want to ask about, because I think that when I was reading that, I was thinking, oh, this is why you wanted to use it, because how the I guess, what was it Protagoras was how they interpreted the Parmenidean that argument, how they interpreted what that said would move them a direction in their conclusions. And that was, I thought we were going to use that to help us to decipher whether or not they went, I guess, a good way or bad way, how they interpreted it.
Yes.
That I think would have
So you're right that that's one of the things you use it for, is just sort of how do people react to this text, but also we want to understand historical Parmenides, we want to understand what Socrates and Plato do with historical Parmenides. We also just want to understand that in this whole tradition, people are having different reactions to this source text of Parmenides. They're having different reactions. They think it means different things. They read it differently, right? And some of them read a heck of a lot into it, like the later Neoplatonists, and others read less into it, like some of these skeptics in the Platonic Academy right after Plato and before all these later Middle Platonists. So its importance wanes and waxes through the history. But we also just want to understand it as an example of negative theology reasoning. The whole topic of the book is, what is negative theology? And this isn't just negative theology as a set of dogmatic claims. It's purporting to be reasoning that can deduce negative conclusions, right? By negative conclusions, because there are things that you cannot say that, the one is this. You cannot say that a deity is that, whatever. But those arguments to negative statements, it's like a prime example of it. Its method is purely dialectical. It's got all these weird paradoxes in it. We'll have to take apart what it actually says it means, but it's also just an example of people trying to engage in something like dialectical metaphysical reasoning about topics which are at first sight purely philosophical, but which according to this whole tradition are also theological. And we want to first just understand the different positions people have in that, but we also just want to understand, in some of these writers, when they go on and they make the claim, they tell you, Plato says the one is above being, and Proclus gives you a trinity which has this, that, and the other as its first 3 moments, whatever. Where the heck are they getting it from? Why do they think that way? Are they making it up, right? Are they reasoning about it? What's the basis for claim 1 versus claim 2, right? And there's a lot of hidden dialectical reasoning, like what we're seeing less hidden in the Parmenides, behind every one of those conclusions, right? People are doing a whole bunch of these dialectical exercises in private, and then they're coming out afterwards and telling you the conclusions from them, right? And you have to realize that a bunch of dialectical reasoning like that is going on behind every public conclusion they give you. Okay, so that's just the core reason we're doing it there is it's an example of this, the reasoning out in the open, all of its steps given. Okay, wonderful question. We definitely want to, right after we get to first reactions, we definitely want to talk about the Parmenides section with a little bit of just history of players before Plato, and then players within the Platonic dialogue, and the key source text that D points to that people react to later, which would be Parmenides, the most important one, the Timaeus is the second most important one, the Symposium is probably the third most important one. She doesn't talk about the Phaedrus, but that might as well be there. But these are sort of there's a few places in maybe the 7th letter, there's a few places in the Platonic corpus that later theological thinking in these different parts of this tradition, including in the purely pagan Platonic tradition, latches onto, right? And we want to make sure that all of those places are sort of pointed out to you while we're still at the Plato part, right? So that they don't get sprung on you for the first time in Scottish Eriugena or something. Okay, more Jim, or
well, I mean,
reactions?
there's so much in here. I think my first reaction would be very easy to read as opposed to some of the more diffuse texts. Not that there wasn't a lot to ponder, there was. I just thought she was very easy to understand, very clear. There's a couple points where I felt like I was waiting. I felt like there was a bit of a contradiction, but I'll ask about those later.
Yep.
But all in all, I mean, my overall reactions are, it's riveting. I feel like I'm watching a story, like I'm watching a movie. I can't wait to see what happens when we get to, like that's, we left right here. It's a cliffhanger, and but I like that. So
Yes.
it's been great.
Enter Plotinus, stage left, right? Sure.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Carrying a 1-1. Okay. Craig, you want to give first reactions?
My first reaction was similar to James. She's building towards Plotinus. It came across somewhat clearly, and she's building a structure that gives a foundation to understand where Plotinus got his stuff from, and so that was kind of interesting. But I admit to a high level of confusion in terms of trying to keep it all sorted out. What I alluded to earlier about not understanding the Greek, and
Sure.
And Joe's concern that I can't convert to Greek on my keyboard to even look up the meanings of it. And
Yes.
And I have a New Testament lexicon for Greek, but I don't have a classical Greek lexicon anywhere around. So that was frustrating in terms of early reactions to it. I mean,
Yes.
clearly an academic study, and
Yes.
but as James pointed out, it did have a thematic quality to it. If I had more time on the little part of Parmenides that you wanted us to work on, I would be drawing logic diagrams to try to unravel what was going on with that.
Yes, I had a friend in grad school who tried to do that for the entire dialectical section, not just the first hypothesis, and he got a diagram out of it, but it was a very complicated diagram. Let's put it that way.
I'm not sure the diagram would be any more enlightening other than to see some of the circularity that was being wrapped around in it. But yeah, I admit to a level of confusion at this point. And
I want to throw in one thing there. I hear you, but I want to throw in one thing there, right? When she's talking about theology in the Middle Platonists, one of the reasons you're confused is they were too, right?
exactly,
There's a wide variety in the theological understandings of Plato, especially in the Middle Platonists. One of the things that happened with Plotinus is that one version of this comes along that kind of sweeps away the other ones, seems to put things together in a neat enough way that the various different previous confusions sort of get dropped. It's not because it's necessarily that's the only way to read it. There's plenty of previous readings which are interestingly different from Plotinus's reading, but they're also not necessarily always consistent with themselves or with their sources, or right. There's a lot of turmoil and confusion about the peak of the metaphysical hierarchy according to the Middle Platonists. Where's being? Where's the good? Where's beauty? Where's the one? Right? Where's mind? Right? And each of them has a different scheme among those, half a dozen names at the top of the hierarchy. And Plotinus will come out with a version of that is, satisfying for all the later Neoplatonists and seems to accord well enough with what it seems like Plato meant, or something like that. Although some of the later Neoplatonists will also try to put it together with what they think Aristotle meant, and they'll wind up putting together triangles and squares and telling you that it's a circle, right? Which is something they'll get taken to task themselves at the joint where the sort of pagan tradition ends and the Christian tradition takes over. It's like debates between Proclus and John Philoponus. Proclus is saying, of course, Plato and Aristotle agreed on all this because they both knew the truth, and the truth agrees. And then John Philoponus will be saying, you're trying to tell me that Plato agreed with Aristotle on the origin of the world? He didn't, right? And just brass tacks, Plato and Aristotle don't agree with one another, right? And that will be sort of the criticism of the later Neoplatonists, is that they're trying to put together too many things which are too different, and they'd only be able to do it by falsifying some of them. But I'm just trying to make this point about confusion. Some of the confusion is the technical terms, difficult subject matter. Some of it is because there's many voices in this conversation. They're not all saying the same thing. And every time you hear a different version of it 50 or 100 years on, you're hearing a slightly different version where there's echoes to some of these things, but they got this other thing differently. And you don't know if they just got that other thing wrong or if the previous ones did, and et cetera. It's a complicated moving Rubik's Cube of where they all come out on this. So the Middle Platonists should be a little bit confusing because they were a little bit confused, or at least they were varied. Let's put it that way. Sorry.
It also gave a little bit more insight that confusion I thoroughly agree with, and it also makes the discussions we had on Gnosticism a little bit broader in the sense that they were coming into this confusion also.
Yes.
It was not just a question of Gnostic versus Christian or Gnostic versus Greek. I agree, there was a broader level of confusion, a time of turmoil in terms of trying
ferment.
to sort all of this out.
Yes.
So that's been helpful in that regard. So it's just a bigger muddle. And of course, Judaism itself, after the temple destruction, was also in its own frame of reorienting itself to something else. And so you could put the whole thing together until you got to Maimonides or something like that to say they hadn't completely sorted things out either.
Yes, I mean, the turmoil doesn't actually stop, but there's no question that it's, at least on this issue of figuring out metaphysical, theological, top of hierarchy of the chain of being or something like that, the ferment is general. It's not just in the philosophers, it's not just in the religious, it's not just in the Gnostics or heretics, it's among all of them together. And they're struggling with remarkably similar issues with quite different methods. But to me, that's one of the interests and attractions of the whole period, especially honestly, after we sort of get to the very last of the Middle Platonists, right before the time of Plotinus and the time of the Gnostics and the time of the early church fathers. That whole period in there, there's just so much going on. So I agree with you. It seems partly that's a confused period, partly it's a fecund period. It's a place where a whole bunch of things got figured out to a depth that is rarely been attained since, I would say. Okay, that's good first reactions. Want to get Joe's first reactions.
Well, first reaction. It was a new subject matter, generally speaking, to me. And so I was reading it. I appreciate your pointing out the chronology detail, because I was beginning to wonder how all of that fit in with the Gnostic wave that Jonas had told us came in from the East. And since we're not familiar with any of these characters, and I'd only heard the name Plotinus and read a little bit about his system when we were looking at the history of being and
Gilson,
who was the guy that was
Gilson, yeah.
So that sort of gave me a chronological frame of reference ever so slightly but I'm glad you clarified that. I've always seen the name Plotinus sort of in a passing reference because he's so quickly skipped over when people want to talk about the emergence of, usually it's Augustine that they jump to. So Augustine is about the farthest back of anyone that I'd previously been familiar with beyond my smattering of exposure to Aristotle and Plato.
Yep. Okay, got it. Check. You're getting, you're off mute, but you're very quiet. I can hear enough of you to know that your mic is on, but your volume is turned down to 0 or something.
Okay, I've turned off my microphone. Does that make me louder?
Yes, you now can be heard. Yes.
Okay, well, I'll turn on my microphone when everybody else is speaking so I can make sure I hear them.
Sure.
But yeah, as Joe had been focused in college on economics, I had been focused on politics. So of course I got some smattering of Plato and of Aristotle through that sideline of study, but never very much directly on philosophy. So the names are new to me. The concepts and the language and the concerns are essentially new to me. I mean, I touched on them again in the process of becoming an adult convert to Christianity, but again, through a Christian lens and
Yep.
not specifically through a philosophical lens. So I'm very appreciative of what I'm being introduced to, although I puzzle and I scratch my head a lot. I think that, again, I naturally was taken aback by the very first line in the D book about the Tao which cannot be spoken is not the Tao.
Yes.
I thought, well, someone knows how to catch my attention.
Yes.
And it brings up the other areas that I probably eventually someday will want to look at further, which is metaphysics in the Chinese tradition of Taoism. The previous understanding that the classical world had of Pythagoras, who is touched on again with a certain amount of, in this book at least, respect. I mean, I had always heard of Pythagoras as being sort of a loony bin in previous discussions because he was so mystical and had such a understanding of numbers, which did not connote politics to me. It just meant numbers are numbers. Although we could look at the 2020 elections and say numbers are indeed magical. But in any case, this is fairly new ground to me, and I'm enjoying the exposure to the newness. Again, I don't have any classical Greek.
Yep.
I had just a little bit of Latin in high school. And so the focus on the classical Greek also makes me wonder, besides with Craig, how much of the use of the words might have shifted between the Platonic and philosophical traditions and what the Christians adopted later into.
Yep. We're definitely going to talk about that in the particular case of apophantic in just a second. But yeah.
Okay.
It's a live issue.
So I expect to profit a lot from this. I don't know that I'll contribute a lot, but there you are.
Well, you'll contribute reactions and questions, which will be just fine. I want to just first talk about the Tao that cannot be spoken. That can be spoken is not the Tao, right? Obviously, she has her ecumenical reasons for wanting to cite that to show that this is an insight which is broader than the one tradition she's talking about. But this is just, it's an acknowledgement from an entirely different tradition of this concept of the ineffable, right? Ineffable means what cannot be spoken, right? And when we say, God is ineffable, we say, cannot be captured in speech, something like that. And D in one of the introduction sections says that all of her friends joke with her that she was writing a book about the inability to write a book about God. What's the book about? It's about the inability to write a book about God. What's it about? Right. There's other places where the mystical tradition, she cites other places in the mystical tradition where it gets weird that way. She quotes Meister Eckhart as saying something like, I pray to God to free me from God, something like that, which is one of the things he was considered heretical for later. But there are places where the peaks of metaphysical speculation and the peaks of mysticism seem to coincide across traditions, right? They're talking about the same kinds of questions. May not all have the same kind of answers to the questions, but they're definitely talking about the same kinds of questions. And limits of thought, limits of reason, limits of discourse, what can be captured in words as opposed to understood by the mind that is using the words, it's behind the words and isn't just in the words, something like that, is a thought that we get in Tao. You get it in Plato, and you also get it in deconstruction in a very different way. But it's not that it's not a new thought, it's that it's a hardy perennial. It's there's something fundamental there about people dream of capturing all the essence of truth in a logical formula or a set of dogmatic statements of positive character that would almost mechanically instantiate the truth independent of any mind contemplating it. There's a dream of being able to do that. The dream fails, right? And accounting for the fact that that dream fails, each of the traditions will have a different way of approaching that fact, but they all agree on that fact, both that the desire of the mind to have it neatly sorted that way is there, and that it doesn't work that way. So that's why I put my interpretation of her reference to the Tao that can be said is not the Tao at the beginning. On Pythagoras, there's many Pythagorases in history and description, right? There's the Pythagoras who is a wonder worker, and people don't realize that, in the time when there was a Neo-Pythagorean revival, wonder workers were a good thing, just like there's lots of miracles in the New Testament. Having miracles told about your teacher was a good way of advertising his wisdom and importance at the time of the Neo-Pythagorean revival, and it wasn't considered as tarring him as strange and magical and weird and not to be taken seriously. It was considered as praise, and people later have, can have a different reaction to that in both cases, by the way. But that's the way I would think about it. The actual historical Pythagoras probably has very little to do with the wonder-working stories about him. He's famous for having founded a kind of political society of philosophers who were trying to actually influence politics that might have been kind of cozy with tyrants, but that was, sort of a mark commonly against them. That was part of the background thoughts / charges against Socrates, was that maybe he was like that too. But besides that sort of political influence, which was generally trying to be in a reasonably ameliorative direction, so to speak, but wouldn't always be seen that way by any local party that it ran across. Besides that, he's famous for his putting extensive importance on mathematics and numbers as supposedly the key to how the natural world actually works. It's not just that he was interested in numbers, it's that he claimed that numbers were the secret code of nature, something like that. And some of the ways in which he thought you could learn that secret code or guess that secret code or manipulate that secret code might have seemed vaguely magical to us these days. Others of it were more like precursors of the idea of mathematical physics and everything in between, right? So it was a new idea, so of course it was kind of wild in its actual implementation in places. He figured out harmony, right? In the sense that he figured out that what our ear hears as harmony was actual rational perfect ratios between frequencies, right? And that was a matter of pure math, that our ears hear pure math, something like that. And he thought that was a deep fact about nature, because harmony is this weird thing that exists only in the relationship between things and isn't a material thing itself. In that sense, it's the perfect example of a mathematical fact, right? You can't find a harmony with a hammer and beat on it with a hammer, right? It exists only in relationships between things. So it became a kind of paradigm thought for them of one way in which relations subsist that isn't material. Anyway, and then obviously, like other Greek mathematicians, he was infatuated with this notion of mathematical truth being something which was perfectly clear, available to everyone, eternal, didn't depend upon opinion, etc. So in that sense, Plato is the inheritor of that Pythagorean love of mathematics as a paradigm of truth. That's why he had "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here" written over the gate of the academy, right? Those are some of the ways in which Pythagoreanism is kind of a background to Plato. Now, there's lots of different people who are backgrounds to Plato. Plato writes the dialogues to be kind of a chorus or symphony of different voices that are around him in the world. He's got a Pythagoras dialogue with Pythagoras character. and he's got a Parmenides dialogue with a Parmenides character, and he has a Parmenidean stranger come in and give Parmenidean doctrines in the Sophist, and he has a Pythagorean stranger come in and give the story of the creation of the world in the Timaeus. When he wants to reach for a creation of the world, who does he go to? He goes to a Pythagorean stranger. And what does the Pythagorean stranger say? He says, the divine artificer looks at the perfect ideas and uses them as a model to create the architecture of the world, which he makes according to perfect solids and numbers, right, in some geometrical way. So the creation story in Plato is Timaeus, and it's a Pythagorean story. He doesn't give a Pythagorean story about the nature of the one, he gives a Parmenidean story about the nature of the one. But for the nature of the creator, he goes to a Pythagorean. Is he doing that because he agrees with the Pythagoreans in the creation of the world? Is he doing that because he's trying to get the symphony of all the voices and have them all represented and have all saying their thing? Different readers of Plato read it differently, right? Certainly the people reading the Timaeus in this tradition thought that he selected the Pythagoreans to explain the creation of the world because he believed that they had the right account of the creation of the world. Something like that. And by the right account, he doesn't mean the right historical account, he means the account that is plausible, something like that, with all the appropriate qualifiers that go into any account about trying to understand anything like a creation. So anyway, that's just some background reaction to bringing up Pythagoras. The other thing to understand is in the period that we're talking about here, there's a Neo-Pythagorean revival that happens hundreds of years after Plato, from roughly, I don't know, 150 BC to 0 BC, roughly. And these are people who they decide that Plato is a Pythagorean, right? And that Pythagoras and Plato agree on the fundamentals. And they are Neo-Pythagoreans without thinking that means that they're Pythagoreans instead of Platonists. They think that they're Platonists and Pythagoreans because they think that Plato is a Pythagorean, right? And they give Pythagorean readings of Plato and they put these things together. What does it mean to have a Pythagorean reading of Plato? Well, the thing that Pythagoras is most famous for in this regard, in his metaphysics, is trying to explain the different highest principles by relating them to numbers. There is the one, and then there's the indefinite dyad. The one is the principle of definition, unity, maybe of being, finitude, comprehensibility. And the indefinite dyad, or two, is the principle of many, of division, of infinity, of matter. So it's almost like you have a one for truth and a two for matter, and then you keep on going off to the rest of the numbers up to 10, right? And you can wind up numerologically spelling out the different principles, just as you can have a 1, 2, 3 in the Trinity, you can have a 1 through 10 in Pythagoras, and he'll tell you how each of them relates to the metaphysical elements of the world. Is that just a numbering scheme? It's not just a numbering scheme. It's partly a numbering scheme, but it's also inheriting something from that number that is something like a principle of definition or unity and a principle of distinction as elements that are there in the notion of one in the first place and the notion of two in the first place. And using that in this kind of dialectical reasoning way, like we were seeing in the Parmenides, is a perfect example of a place where the Pythagoras tradition, the Platonic tradition, and the Parmenidean tradition might touch in a way that the thing we read there as the first hypothesis is a meditation on what one would mean, right? What would one mean if it were really one? So one is to exclude any possible multiplicity. By the way, that includes a multiplicity of thought, or a difference between the thought and the thing thought, because all of those are multiplicity. And if thought needs distinction, then if you can't make a distinction, because distinction implies at least two, then you're not going to have thought about it. And all kinds of weird consequences come from this notion of a one in which no two-ness enters, right? But that's the kind of thinking that you already see in Plato's Parmenides, and maybe it was there in Parmenides himself, that you would also, that also has a Pythagorean ring to it, because it's trying to infer metaphysical principles out of logical deductions about a number, right? So I hope that helps on the Pythagorean connection. Reactions, questions?
Just a quick follow-up on the Neo-Pythagorean. revival. You say it starts maybe about 150 BC. So
Yes.
is there, are there a number of such proponents? Do they have an effect on Platonism per se?
They have some effect on Platonism per se. They're also just their own thing. This is the stuff covered in chapter 2 from page 46 on. They influence the academy. It will help if we go through just a little bit of the history of Plato's academy, because this will help, right? So right after Plato, the first people reacting to Plato at the academy think of Plato in a very skeptical way, right? The part of Plato that they're hanging their hat on is the only thing that I know is that I know nothing, says Socrates, right? So they have this kind of academic skepticism, and the first place that they come out is this very sort of skeptical, school debating kind of humility about claims of knowledge pose is the grand takeaway from Plato for them, right? That doesn't last very long, right? They start getting more positive about the knowledge claims they think they can make as Platonists. As soon as there are rivals, as soon as there is an Aristotle saying something else, and a Chrysippus and the Stoics saying something else, suddenly the academy decides, oh, actually, there's some positive doctrines in Plato, and it's not enough to just say that anything could happen. Actually, the Stoics are wrong on point X, and the Aristotelians are wrong on point Y, and so on. And it's in that context that you get this Neo-Pythagorean revival, because they're trying to have a Platonism which especially isn't Stoicism. From the point of view of this line of Platonism, the Stoics, so let's explain a little bit about the Stoics. The Stoics try to keep most of the moral teaching of Plato and Aristotle as they understood it, but they don't necessarily agree with all of its physics. They want a pantheistic, materialistic physics, remember it this way. God is the soul of the world. It is the logos. It is the order in things, right? And that's the only God there is. They have a material cosmos. They have entirely material physics, but they have some principle of internal order in it that you can call, reason or the logos, and you can deify if you like, but it's a pantheistic kind of deity that isn't personal at all, right? And that's sort of the place that the Stoics went. They also elaborated a bunch of stuff on logic and so on. And reacting to that, the Pythagoreans were like, no, none of this stuff is about matter. This isn't a matter-based system, right? The truths of mathematics are not something which is inside the sphere of the heavens. It's not something which is merely a fact about an order that's present in the world, right? So they're disagreeing with the Stoics as making everything too immanent, and not having any notion of the transcendent, and not understanding the transcendent nature of mathematical truth, and so on. They're way too materialist for them. So the Neo-Pythagoreans try to distinguish their brand of Platonism from anything like the Stoics, because the Stoics to them aren't Platonists anymore. They become too materialist to be Platonists. And because they're trying to reemphasize this transcendent and mathematical aspect of Plato against this sort of immanent materialist Stoicism, you get this split of the parts of the academy that don't want to go in the Stoic direction, march off on their own Pythagorean drum. So that's sort of what causes the original split. It's a disagreement with the Stoics over materialism and pantheism. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Craig. I think we were still doing first reactions. Oh, we already did you. I was fooled because I was going in a counterclockwise direction, and you changed
right.
position. We've already done
Yeah,
everyone. Okay.
You already got everyone.
All right.
The one thing I did find interesting as I went into your discussion on the one and the whole thing on Parmenides.
Yes.
Is what flashed to me was Spencer Brown's book, Laws of Form. He skips the one.
Yes.
He says first make a distinction. He starts with two.
You have to start with two because you can't think without two, right? Yes.
Yeah, and I thought that was a suddenly fascinating aspect that there is no one in any discussion by Brown or any of the categorical work that came after him.
The closest you get is in the sort of number theorists. The set theorists trying to give, they're going to spin everything up from the ground of set theory in this logical distinction way, and they will start with their notion of the one is the empty set, right?
Yeah.
The set that contains only the empty set is the set whose number of members is one. Its only member is the empty set. So they have the empty set, and then they have the set of the empty set, and set of is the only operation they need, and that's how they'll get one, right? Now the problem with this is that the set containing only the empty set is itself already a very compound notion. You have to know what a set is. You have to distinguish between the definition of the set and its members. There's all kinds of things in it that involve two from a Pythagorean point of view, right? But this is still an attempt to get something which is a basis of number out of as little as possible, so to speak, as input. And you get a surprising amount of that with very similar Pythagorean inventiveness, I can put it this way, in the 19th century by people like Cantor and some of the founders of set theory. Yes, they pretty much have all agreed with the point that's already been made here in Parmenides that there is no thought without distinction, and distinction requires two, right? But that then gets back to, let's put on a Jungian lens for a second. What does it mean about the original unity, right? There's still some notion of an archetype of the original unity that is before any distinction. And this, by the way, also relates back to Taoism, because Taoism is a unity that is put together from every original distinction, right? So whatever original distinction you want to make, you can map it onto the two sides of the Tao, right? But the actual Tao is the whole thing, the unity of that distinction, right? And that's the same notion, that there has to be some unity within distinction at the basis of every organizing order in the world, something like that. And that's just a place where Taoism, Pythagorean, set theory, any of those things are going to line up. It's a necessary basis of something like rationalism. If you're going to try to spin out the nature of the world from rational principles, you're going to notice this conundrum that you cannot start from anything without it being a unity. And as soon as it's a true unity, it doesn't admit a distinction, something like that.
Yeah, which then leads to most of them jumping over to saying it's irrational or non-rational or paradoxical, because they can't get a rational answer out of it.
Sometimes they reach over to its irrational, sometimes they reach over just to its indefinite, and they'll read indefinite as infinite.
Yeah, or unknown, which is where we're going.
Or unknown, or unknowable, which is even worse than unknown. Yes, but yes, this is, and we should probably, well, we should almost right after that segue to jump into the part of the Parmenides we're reading. But I first want to just mention a couple other things that we had talked about, the changes of meanings of terms, and there's one that we already talked about, ineffable, but I want to talk about apophantic for a second, because she, in the intro, she lays out there's different versions of theology. There's positive theology, which tries to make claims about God, and there's something like the way of the immanent, and there's the way of taking away, and so forth. There's these different versions of it. But the main thing she's talking about is apophantic, and by apophantic she means something like negative discourse, right? What something is not, the statements of what something is not. And this is a perfectly historically attested, regular use of apophantic, but it's not the original use of apophantic. And so I want to just clear up some confusions about what apophantic is. This usage comes from Dionysius the Areopagite, which is probably early 500s, maybe late 400s. We're not quite sure. We'll come back to that. But it's in that context, specifically talking about theology, that apophantic means something like negative statements about God. But the word apophantic originally just means away from and speech. The phantic is speech or discourse, and the apo is away from. And the person who coined that term is Aristotle. But what Aristotle means by it is something like logical assertion. He means speech that is actually trying to, predicate something as true about its subject, and isn't trying to talk about the words, it isn't trying to talk about the language, but is trying to point away from the language to the things that it's talking about, right? And the away from in the original Aristotelian thing is saying the words are pointing away from themselves towards the things, something like that. Now, that's also, if you read Heidegger, that's the version of apophantic you'll get at the beginning of Being in Time, where he'll say that it's about disclosive speech. It's about speech which reveals what is, or something, is what apophantic means to a Heidegger who's reading his Aristotle, right? But by the time you're in a little 100 or 200 years after Aristotle, apophasis is being used as a term for negation. It's not no longer just being used for assertion, but assertion and negation get coupled, and the apophasis winds up being the away from speech of negation, and it's as a term for negation that it winds up being used, picked up again by Dionysius as this term for negative theology. But the point is, apophantic turns a somersault from being positive speech, which is, actually ascribing some true reality to a being, to only making negative statements about something. And it turns that somersault between Aristotle and Dionysus, and some of it has already turned in the first 200 years of that. But we talked about, when do these terms change their meaning? Do they have a different meaning for the classical Greeks of Plato and Aristotle than they do for the Christians? And the answer is, in the case of apophantic, absolutely it does. Apophantic to Aristotle means something more like logical assertion, and by the time of Dionysus, it means a negative statement. Okay, any questions about apophantic?
I had one about cataphatic, the opposite.
Yes, okay, go.
Cataphatic.
Towards
And
speech.
page 5, yeah, because this is one introduction. I don't know if we're jumping right to the chat first.
No, go ahead.
Uh,
Ask your cataphatic question.
Yeah, whether or not she seems to suggest that there's a link between negative theology and mysticism because of cataphatic expressing of theology. Do you think that she's right about that, or is
You got some distortion on your mic.
Oh, sorry.
That's better. That's better. Yep. So the answer is, cataphatic speech just means towards speech, and the use of it to mean positive statement is there. He's getting it from Dionysus, and it's there, and it's something like what he means as positive statement. In more original terms, it might mean something where it was the language trying to talk about itself, right? If you're talking about something which was true on the face of it from the meaning of the words, right? Rather than something which was true materially, right? Something which was speech about speech. If you say that dog spelled backward is God, right? You're talking about the speech. You're not talking about the references of the speech, right? You're talking about the spelling of a word. Naively, that would be cataphantic, right? But she's using it in this later sense as towards speech, positive speech. And the thing that she's thinking of especially as positive speech is something like dogmatic formulas, right? The Nicene Creed will give you a dogmatic formula for what is true about the Trinity. And it'll put it in positive terms, and it'll say, you have to believe this, right? And or say this is true about this, right? All of those sorts of versions of positive speech he's calling cataphantic theology. None of them are telling you what you don't know about something or what something isn't. They're telling you what something is, right? Then the question is, how much can you actually say positively about something like deity? And her claim is, all the mystics agree, not very much, right? The amount of positive stuff you can know about God will fit in a thimble, right? So if you want to know anything more, you're going to have to go to the negative, is sort of the claim. Why does that issue in mysticism? It only issues in mysticism if the result of all the negative claims is some kind of aporia or unknowability, because then you're left with a kind of unknowability. And what do you do with the unknowability? And the mystic's answer is you dive headfirst into it, right? It turns into this sort of experiential, self-transformative understanding of things rather than a purely discursive, what does the logic or the reasoning say about this external thing that doesn't have anything to do with me, right? And that's how the mystical grows out of the apophantic for D, and plenty of people in the tradition. But that's where she's getting that notion from. If you're left with a complete aporia, complete inability to understand by the negative claims, then you're not going to be entirely satisfied with that just unknowing, and you're going to look for some knowing in the unknowing, even if it's the knowing that you do not know, right? And that's going to have some experiential, mystical aspect. It's not just a claim, it's a diagnosis of what's going on in the tradition, so to speak. Is that clear? Get a nod from Jim.
Yes,
okay.
and I have another question, but it was on page 10 of the introduction, if we're still staying in there.
No, go to your question on page 10.
Yeah, it was. I was interested. I know this was mentioned earlier by Craig, and how's that with the distortion? Better?
Yes, it's better. Thanks.
I'm interested in seeing how the ineffable nature of God could not be easily dismissed by a logician or as an irrational dodge by the logician.
Sorry. Where are you?
I was on page 10 and just reading about the ineffability and knowability. is the one, is the
All right,
foundation.
I'm looking at page 10 and I'm trying to find where you are. I haven't found it yet.
The second sentence is, I believe that the fundamental
Got it.
assertion.
Got it.
And I just had a question afterwards, and I'm sure we'll probably parse that out as we go through. The question I had was, how does she show that the ineffable nature of God can't be easily dismissed by logicians or and categorized as an irrational dodge, or like how the skeptics treated it? Because I don't remember her going into too much detail about how the skeptics respond to that.
She's not going to go into any detail about how the skeptics respond to it. She mentioned some of the things about the sort of early agnosticism of Protagoras at the very beginning of the book, without ever going back to it. She's never taking on skeptics here. She's always just going with the what do the people in the negative theology tradition itself say about what is knowable and knowable about God, and if there's going to be any proof of the conclusion, it has to be borne out by the fruits or whatever, the results she finds. It's not, she's not contrasting this with anything. It's never going to be, the debate between the negative theologians and the positive theologians at this particular debate or something. She's just presenting the negative theologians' side of things, if that makes sense. So some of the other claims she's making here about it are her own, right? They're not coming from her, well, they're partly coming from her sources. She's agreeing with all the mystics among her sources, is the right way to put that. But just agreeing with them. The evidence that's going to be there for it is going to be the evidence they present, right? She's just testifying here that she finds it persuasive, is basically all she's saying. Right, and then the last part of that, she just gives all the different ways in which it can be unknown, right? Or finally accessible only through the mystical union, right? And she says that these various different kinds of unknowability can be laid out as, you can ticket and sort each of these thinkers into where they put that unknowability, how they classify it, what level of that sort of distinctions. I think her own tendency is clear. She's all the way on the people who say finally accessible only through a mystical union, right? That's sort of where she comes out, but she also says it as, this is what they say, we who haven't had this mystical union experience don't know ourselves, something like that, right? She never makes the claim that she is a disciple of Meister Eckhart who has, achieved such union herself. She never makes any claims like that for herself. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I think maybe the best way I could have framed it was when I was reading about, and I always say his name wrong, Specipus, when she talks about,
yes.
yeah, when she talks about his direct inheriting, he was a nephew of Plato, and how sort of the history started to develop from there. I got that there were some Aristotelian people, obviously in the academy and mingling there, and everyone was getting along, sort of. The Neoplatonists, the Middle Platonists, and even
we're in
Stoics
Neoplatonists. We're in Neoplatonists, but keep going.
Oh, yeah. But I guess what I'm trying to ask is, it seems like each group that started to be an influence in the academy were still Platonists, including Stoics. And I was wondering why skeptics were left out, or if it seemed like they were just sort of left out of the fold. But the others,
yes, I mean, so the early skeptics, the early academy, right there, those are the early Platonists, so the Platonists before the Middle Platonists, right, do kind of get left out here, in part because they kind of didn't have any influence on the academy after a short period of time, more or less, except they had their own offshoot, the Sextus Empiricus kind of classical skeptics, who sort of a comeback version of this, but that's it's no longer the main line of Platonism. It's a school debaters thing, or it's a separate thing. It's like, just like the Epicureans break off on their own thing, so do the skeptics in the sense of Sextus Empiricus skeptics. But in terms of this, the Aristotelians and such, I mean, Aristotle is of course in the academy himself when he is writing, but by the time he's late in his life, and certainly by after, it's broken away to its own thing. It's become its own school, and the same thing happens with the Stoa, right? They split off to be their own thing. And each of those splits, right, sort of leaves its mark on Greek philosophy, but doesn't leave its mark on the academy specifically, because the academy specifically means the guys who stayed in the Plato school. That's what the academy means. It's just the word for those who stayed with the Platonic school. Whereas those who, broke off with the porch, that's what the Stoa means, because that's where they gathered, right? And those who went on walks, the Peripatetics, that's they just walked around. That's the Aristotelians, right? But the academy means they stayed in this place over here, and the porch means they went over there, and the Peripatetics means they walked around. But those colloquial names for the schools are really just ways of saying Plato, Aristotle, Zeno, right? For the Stoics. I don't know if that helps, but
No, that helps a lot. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Yeah.
That cleared it up.
great. Joe, you had a question? Okay. Speaking of which, I wanted to mention the two Zenos, because some people get confused about this, and it's one of these little points of history that there's too many Zenos in the world. The first Zeno is the Xenos Paradoxes of you get halfway to it, halfway again, but never get there, right? That's the direct student of Parmenides, right? And he's actually present in our dialogue. The Parmenides, he's Parmenides' literary executor, etc. Right? The later Zeno is the founder of Stoicism, and there's a couple of Zafram and Cleanthes and I forget the other guy's name, who are Sisyphus, I think, who are the sort of big Stoics, refounders of Stoicism. But the second Zeno, who's from Cyprus, basically, is hundreds of years after the original Zeno, who's the Zeno of the Paradoxes, who is a student of Parmenides. But don't get confused, the student of Parmenides with the Stoic Zeno, minor aside. Okay, so much on schools and background. It's finally time to talk about this Parmenides chapter, this Parmenides section, the first hypothesis. And just as background, as Craig said, this whole thing's happening in a dialogue. Dialogue is the young Socrates explaining his notion of the ideas to a very old Parmenides. Their ages could have barely overlapped, so this is maybe a semi-fictional account, so to speak. But a very old Parmenides supposedly comes to Athens and has a conversation with a very young Socrates about the nature of the ideas. And the young Socrates is trying to explain his notion of the ideas to Parmenides. Parmenides is saying, well, that's a very nice, precocious idea, but it's got all these problems with it. And he presents all the arguments against the ideas that have ever been advanced, including those advanced by Aristotle. Plato advanced them all himself out of the mouth of Parmenides, supposedly when Socrates was, barely out of his teens, or probably still in his teens, right? The third man argument and various other arguments about the supposed incoherence of the notion of the ideas. Okay, all of that is the first part of the dialogue. And after that, basically the comeback is, okay, that's all very well, but what do you positively have to say for yourself in these things? And Parmenides' reaction is, you can't actually get to the truth about any of these things until you go through a long exercise in dialectic and learn how to reason about these things dialectically. And he says, well, how would you do that? And he says, well, you have to consider for everything, what would happen if it was or if it was not the case in every possible way. Basically, he's saying you have to assume every possible starting point and its contrary and reason out to what the logical conclusion would be and see if you reached a contradiction along any of those chains of reasoning, right? And the surface of the rest of the dialogue is a long exercise like that was probably of the kind that was written by Zeno, but it's presented here as the speech of Parmenides, as one long speech. And it's going to do all of those assumings of either side of a proposition about the one and the many, that they are or only seem to be or are not, right? And every possible combination of those things is going to be assumed to be true or untrue. And the I don't know if it's the moral, the comical aspect of the dialogue is every single one of those things will result in a aporia of contradictions or things which seem incredible, right? So that you will, starting from every premise, you reach a contradiction from every, or a seeming contradiction from every chain of reasoning. They all end aphoretically. And this is, some people say that's why it's just a logical exercise, right? Because you're going through all this reasoning, but all the conclusions you arrive at are absurd. And others say the conclusions aren't nearly as absurd as you think, right? That's the sort of Neoplatonic reading of the Parmenides. And still thirds will say, well, some of the conclusions might be absurd, but if you track through what they actually depended upon, you'll find that there's a doctrine actually being propounded, which is more positive than you might think, and resolves some of these things. You put in a distinction here, you don't accept this premise because it leads to a crazy conclusion, but you accept everything before it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the point is, this turns into a P game with many possible locations of every possible critical proposition that you can turn up and down and get all kinds of conclusions, outcomes from. Okay, so that's the basic outline of the whole dialogue. In that whole dialogue, what's the position of this one? This position is the very first one that Parmenides lays out. It's called the first hypothesis, and it's the assumption that the one is. That's it. We're going to see what happens if we assume that the one is. And the end of the reason it seems aphoretic is the very end of it. He says, if the one is, then the one does not participate in being in any way whatsoever. Right? So this is the seeming contradiction that ends the first hypothesis, and the reaction of the interlocutor, the young student, is, he's asked, can things really be this way? Well, then is it possible this is the way it is concerning the one? No, it sure doesn't seem to me. Sure doesn't seem so to me, at least. Right? So, and they say, do you want to start again? And they go to the second hypothesis. We're only going to talk about the first hypothesis, right? You read the whole thing through, right? And there's all these conclusions about indivisibility and being outside of time and all this other kind of stuff. And you can ask yourself, what do these things really depend upon? What are the critical assumptions that everything else follows from? And the first is just simplicity. If the one is, then it is simple, so it cannot partake in any way of anything many. And then you find that almost everything thinkable, or everything you reason about, participates in one way or another in many. Right? So that's the first half. The second half is after they've done that and they've noticed that many is one of the things that has many about it is the way in which things are in time. They can have a past and a future and a present, and all those things are different moments of their relation to time. So if something has any relation to time, it has manyness in it, right? And so from this, the conclusion is just that the one, if it exists, has nothing to do with time. So far, it's just like the conclusions from the previous. It's based upon the simplicity argument. But then, I don't know if people notice this, but then towards the end of it, he slips in the second real premise, which is that if it doesn't participate in any of the ecstasies of time, so to speak, to speak Heidegger for a second, then it doesn't participate in being. And his interlocutor blithely agrees, because being is one of those tense verbs, which has to do, because it has a tense, it has to do with a relation to time. So in that sense, the second conclusion, that being is in no way whatsoever, depends upon the immediately previously smuggled in assumption that to be is to be in time. The equation of to be is to be in time is the equation of being with actuality, because actuality is, whatever is in time. So there's two kinds of conclusions that you arrive at in the first hypotheses. One of them are all the weirdnesses that result from something being simple, including it being outside of time. And the other is that if you assume that being is a time relation kind of actuality word, then something outside of time has no actuality and is in no way whatsoever, right? But it's important to notice that those are two distinct things. There's two places where there's critical assumptions made. All the other things are strict deductions from those two. All the other things are, you can ask, how sensible is it to say that if something is one, that it is not many in any way whatsoever? That's the piece which all the weirdness of the first half of the dialogue sort of depends upon. And that's what Plato plays around with relaxing in the dialogue of the Sophists, when he talks about how the greatest kinds intermingle with one another in various ways. And by intermingle with one another, he's trying to say something like, the fact that something is one and also is being doesn't mean that because one and being are two things, that something which is both being and one isn't one, right? But this is a whole doctrine of the transcendentals, which is found in the Sophist. I'm just throwing that out there because the later Plato, not this Parmenides character in one of his dialogues, the later Plato has some ways to deal with some of these issues, right? But in the dialogue itself, it's just presented as one means simple, simple means no many means none of the things you think of as distinction. And the result is something like an incomprehensibility because thought requires distinction. Okay, I'm going to pause for reactions to that explanation of what's going on in this whole Parmenides passage. Anyone else see other things in it that I'm not bringing out, or reactions to what I see in it? Craig.
One thing that jumped out, and it's totally out in left field, but it just kind of popped at me, is how does this Parmenides dialogue relate to Hegel's description of the whole?
So it's fair. I mean, there's lots of ways in which Plato is dependent on the same kind of process of dialectical reasoning, some of which results in contradictions or negations and negations and negations and so forth, which is playing around with the same kind of dialectic. There's also ways he may even be directly dependent upon the Neoplatonic versions of that, in Proclus in particular. The place which is probably closest in this in Hegel is his logic, not his like philosophy of mind or phenomenology of mind. In the logic, he sort of starts with these, first principles of things, and reaches contradictions that require a sublimation to some new unity that puts those two things together. And he thinks he has his version of how that works because he's copying from how Fichte did it in his science of knowledge rather. Yes, there's definitely a dependence in that direction, in the sense that Hegel is looking back on things like this and Proclus, and he's writing his own version of how these concepts can fit together and the contradictions can be overcome, but always in the direction of greater lack of simplicity is not a problem for Hegel, right? Whereas in here, if you depart from simplicity, you've departed from one and you've already left the building, right? And Hegel does not try to stick with that. Simple is only one side of a dichotomy that will be sublimated into some very complicated hierarchy by the time you've gotten to page 3 in Hegel. Fine question.
Thanks.
Yep. Jim, reactions or questions about this Parmenides section?
Well, was I completely off my rocker with my first thought was that the purpose of it was part of the purpose, not the purpose, was to point to the unknowable, to make that really driven home. I thought that was the outcome. You could go all the other directions, but that was something you'd really get. At least for me, I thought that was, and I liked that. It helped me. It helped to clarify some things for me.
So unknowable might be a conclusion, but the only place where knowability is brought up directly in the section itself is where he talks about, is it thinkable? And thinkable, if you're thinking about it, you have thought about it in it, right? And those are two, not one, and these sorts of things. The main thing you hit is something like, it has to be completely incorporeal, it has to be completely outside of time, it has to be completely simple, and these other weird things like that. And you can ask yourself, can anything actually be like that, right? Is he describing anything that exists? And it sounds like no, this is like a contradictory set of attributes or something. The closest you could probably get, if you wanted to try to take one concept and take your own version of that concept and slot it in there and see how many of these things it ticks off, might be truth. Although truth might not seem simple to you, it might seem very ramified. But it's worthwhile to go through the sections with a hypothesis like that in your head and see what it ticks off and doesn't. The fundamental thing, though, here is just there's something paradoxical itself about the notion of one as admitting of no distinction whatsoever, right? To admit of no distinction whatsoever and to be unthinkable are close to being the same notion, because we think by distinction. We cannot think without making a distinction. And that, by the way, that you cannot think without making a distinction is there in Plato, it's there in Hegel, it's there in the Tao, right? There's multiple places where that same thought comes up. Very few people conclude from that therefore there is a fundamental important metaphysical entity that we cannot think, and that is one, and that is outside of time. But that's how the Neoplatonists read this section, right? they're not thinking that the one being talked about there is truth, and they're not thinking the one being talked about there is just, some undetermined something or other that you can't know something about. So the claims are only being made about knowledge. They think that's talking about, in negative terms, but still talking about the nature of transcendent God as completely outside time, as completely not thinkable, right, and all those kinds of things. The places you get closest to that, and people we might be familiar with other things, would be something like the original unity notion in Jung, right, is definitely referring to the same concept. The other thing to notice here is that what is the concept that has these characteristics for this Plato's Parmenides? It's not being that has these characteristics. It's one, right? He's not starting
Yeah.
from the notion of a good. He's not starting from a notion of beyond being. He's not starting from a notion of beauty. He's starting from the notion one. And it is one that will have all these, strangely transcendent characteristics. Now, the original historical Parmenides doesn't talk about one very much. He talks about being and thought being the same and not the same. And he talks about the ways of being, the three ways: the way of being, the way of seeming, in which there is no true reliance, in which being and not being are the same and not the same, and the way of the altogether not, which I adjure you not to take, right? So being is in the historical Parmenides is kind of the key category, and you don't hear much about one. Whereas a Parmenidean one, you hear quite a bit about in Plato's Parmenides, right? The Parmenidean one is talked about by Zeno and so forth. It might have been something which was there originally in Parmenides. The actual extant fragments we have from Parmenides talk about being more than they talk about one. But here, the notion that has all these weird characteristics is definitely one. Why does this matter? It matters because in a lot of these later thinkers, you'll hear someone saying, we cannot know about this. We cannot reason about this. You cannot assume that your concepts about it are the same as the thing, and so on, right? But most of these conclusions are deductions from a single logical concept, unity, or one, right? So it's not like you're claiming that you can't deduce something from it. You are deducing something from it. You're unpacking what you think is contained in a notion, right? It's already logical metaphysical reasoning. Whatever aporias it ends in, you're starting with some kind of assumption that you know how to think about one, something like that. And there'll be plenty of other theologies that don't want it to be one that they start from. But okay, so but as an example of the reasoning, of the kind of reasoning, and of the paradoxical nature of the conclusions you can reach from it, this is, absolutely necessary to know that there's a there, to know that this isn't just, reporting what someone once thought because he was wacky and hadn't settled down or something. That's not what's going on here. Each of these different positions at least thinks that it has some kind of reasoning behind it, and often reasoning of this kind. Okay, I'm not suggesting that anyone be convinced by that argument of the first hypothesis, but understand when you get to someone like a Proclus, he'll write a book on the theology of Plato. He says, where do we find the theology of Plato? Well, we find it in various places, like the seventh letter and this other place. But the most important place we find it is in the Parmenides, because in the first and second hypotheses of the Parmenides, that he talks about the first and second persons of the Godhead. Okay, there will be later Christian Platonist version of this will actually take this one, and they will think that the one being talked about in the first hypothesis is only the Father, right? No reference to the incarnation, right? There'll be others that will say, this is the reason why the Gnostic thinks there's a transcendent God who is above the physical universe, right? Is the first hypothesis kind of negative arguments. If the God is completely outside of time, right? The idea of a completely simple God that's completely outside of time having any relation to time or relation to things in time is kind of a round square. And that's why the Gnostics don't. Okay, so all all right, this is maybe too much of the content too soon, so to speak, but I wanted you to get an example of what the basic reasoning is in this whole field that's going to set off something like negative theology. Now, Dee makes the claim that Plato himself is not really the founder of negative theology, because all of this is not some positive claim by Plato about the truth about metaphysics or theology. It's just something one character said off in one dialogue about something called the One. And nobody claimed the One was God in that dialogue. And it's not anything like the only thing Plato says on such topics. It's just a piece of metaphysical reasoning by one of Plato's characters to reflect what Parmenides might thought about something, which is very far from a positive dogmatic statement about theology. So from her point of view, lots of other people read something like negative theology back into Plato, but Plato himself makes no dogmatic claims like that. And I think she's right about that. It may be there, but it's there as something which was already in the world around him that he is referencing and talking about, not as something which he is positively advocating for as the truth about metaphysics or something like that. Okay. So
You're referring to page 23 where she goes through the categories. She goes through each part, 137C, D, D.
I'm actually thinking of the end of chapter 1 on page 34. Right, so where she says, on the basis of text where Plato used negative terms to describe the highest reality, I think it is possible to say that the good and the beauty are each in some way transcendent and indescribable. The final condition necessary for fully developed negative theology, that of the unknowable the highest cause, is not explicit in Plato's philosophy. Plato always attempts to examine the true nature of reality. In the end, Plato does not state dogmatic doctrines in neither way may we, right? Meaning about him. So her fundamental claim there is that Plato doesn't have a dogmatic theology, right? So he certainly didn't invent the dogmatic theology that is called negative theology, right? So, and I think she's just on solid ground there. But this is just, there she's taking in not just Plato's Parmenides, but Plato as a whole. And we'll talk about the other essential sections in Plato for all these questions in a second, but I first just want to wrap on the Parmenides section specifically. The other key things we have to talk about are the reference to the good as being beyond being in the Republic. We need to talk about the Timaeus and the creation in the Timaeus, and we need to talk a little bit about the Symposium. But if we want to get a general picture, well, maybe, and also the lecture on the good, Plato's lecture on the good, which is something we only have a report of from third parties. But if I want to flesh out all the different things in Plato that people in this whole negative theology tradition pointed back to for thinking about Plato and theology, it would be like a set of those 5, maybe another 6 things, of which the Parmenides dialogue and that first hypothesis specifically is only one of them, right? And it's not even, by Plato's own presentation, it's not even the most important of them. So before we get to an overall assessment of Plato, we got to see the other things in Plato that bear on this. But first, just any further questions about the Parmenides part? Or we're ready to move on.
I think I understand, but mine was more like I'm starting to think about the hierarchy of good and
yes.
the good.
Okay, let's go there.
Beauty. Yep.
Yeah. So let's go there. So the critical text for this is in the Republic. Socrates, speaking to Glaucon, says he's explained to him the divided line and where how the intelligibles differ from the perceptibles, and then he'll say that. But higher than even the intelligibles, or the ideas that are the intelligibles, is the idea of the good, which is what lends not only the intelligibility, but also the being to the intelligibles. And the good surpasses even being in dignity and age. Sorry, in age, people translate dignity, it's actually age. In age and power, right? So more powerful than being and older than being, or more venerable than being, is the idea of the good. That's what you get in Plato's Republic. It's an almost throwaway line. It's not really a throwaway line. It's meant to be very important, but it's also meant to be something which he doesn't expect his interlocutor Glaucon to entirely comprehend. Right? It's meant to dazzle. And Glaucon's response is, "What a demonic excess," or something like this. But that is to be beyond being is a demonic excess. Why does this matter? This matters in part because there's lots of theologies, especially those coming out of reactions to I am that I am in Exodus, that there are theologies that are being theologies that have, being as the highest God or something like that. We saw a bunch of that in Gilson, right? And the people relating to Gilson, including people like in the Middle Ages, like Avicenna and so forth, where something like the idea of being was close to being their notion of God. Well, Plato is saying whatever notion of being you have, his notion of good, he's saying, is beyond that. It's above that. It's the cause of the being of the beings, and it's the cause of the intelligibility of the intelligibles, and it's the cause of the being of the intelligibles, according to Plato. So this is a hierarchy that puts something above whatever tier being is on. Okay, and that's explicit, dogmatic doctrine, so to speak, in Plato. And he gives some reason for it. He gives an analogy of the idea of the good in the realm of the intelligibles being like the sun in the realm of the perceptibles. It is what provides the light by which things are seen. Okay. There's a place off in the Symposium where instead of talking about the idea of the good, he talks about beauty. And he talks about getting a glimpse of the idea of beauty. And he also talks about the intermediary between the thinker and the idea of beauty, or maybe the idea of the good, as being love. It's the notion is that the way that the good operates is by attracting, right? So you have to understand what attraction is. You have to understand what there is an intermediary step between the would-be knowing mind and the highest truth that it can know, and that intermediate step is longing or love. Okay, so that's often the different dialogues, often the Symposium, which is supposed to be a doctrine on love. Okay. The fourth place would be the Timaeus. Timaeus, as I told you before, is the case where you have this Pythagorean character as opposed to a Parmenidean character. It's not Socrates. And he comes in and he gives the Pythagorean story about the most likely account about how the physical world came to be, right? And he presents it as being created by a demiurge, a creator, who is not said to be one, not said to be good. He's just said to be the creator, right? His definition is creator. And he looks away to the already existing pattern of the eternal ideas to determine what to make, right? So the ideas pre-exist the demiurge, and the demiurge makes the physical universe by looking away to the perfection of the ideas, like an architect looks at a plan of blueprints. Okay, so that's a way in which the Platonic idea notion is assimilated to the Pythagorean, there's mathematical truth behind the world as bones of the world or relations of the world kind of understanding. But all of this is said by Plato to be only a most likely account, and he says to understand what is true about God creating the world is most difficult, and to explain it to everyone impossible. Right, so the understanding is difficult, but for people to get people to comprehend it is impossible. There's a greater difficulty of the transmission of the truth once seen than it is in the apprehension of the truth in the first place. Okay, these are the different places. Well, there's also a place in the second letter where he makes a very elusive reference to the idea of the good in the Republic as being the first and king, right? And then other principles under it, something like that. But it's it's relatively vague. You have to read a lot into it to see that that's he's still talking about the idea of the good there. He doesn't say the idea of the good. Okay, I've just laid out a whole bunch of places where Plato talks about God stuff, right? And where later people in this tradition, both the Platonists and the Neoplatonists and some of the Christians, look back on it and they see echoes of their own theological ideas. The most distinctive of Plato, the thing which is most unique to Plato in that whole series, is this idea of the good being beyond being. That's characteristically Platonic. You don't find it in anybody else. It's the place where he's original. He didn't get that from the Pythagoreans. He didn't get that from Parmenides. That's Plato himself. The notion that the good is beyond being. Okay. Jim, you have a bunch of questions about hierarchy in Plato. Go.
Well, I think you answered a lot of that. I was wondering about where the one would fit in. I guess that would be beyond even the good. And then underneath the good would be being,
Right.
and then becoming. And I'm also wondering about, I can't stop thinking about Heidegger again, because I know he tried to say that bedrock was being or becoming. And I'm trying to now.
So
doing
Plato thinks that the intelligibles are more understandable than the sensibles, and therefore he thinks that everything about being and the eternal and the mathematical is more knowable than anything about the historical or the end time or the actual. And that's why he gives the creation of the world stuff off to a Pythagorean rather than his own voice, and also why he, couches it with all this is insofar as we can know these things because we can't really know things about things that happen in time, something like that. As for the one business, right, in original Plato, you don't find much of it, but we do get this report later from third parties that says, and once in his life, Plato gave a big public lecture on the idea of the good, and everybody turned out and everybody went away, and none of them understood it, and they were all confused, and they were expecting something entirely different from what they got, because all he did is he went on and he talked about how, all these different things in geometry and astronomy and all these things in math that nobody could understand. And after he had gotten done talking about all that, he ended up the whole thing by saying that, so the good is the one. That was supposedly the conclusion of Plato's famous lecture on the good that nobody understood, and nobody understood especially why he's bringing up all these mathematical things in it, because it didn't seem to be about ethics at all. Okay, what the heck was going on there? So we can reconstruct it partly, but understand this is a reconstruction. This is me, not Plato, right? The reconstruction is that in the Republic, where he's explaining that the idea of the good is the cause of the intelligibility of the intelligibles, the good is something like appropriate measure. And things having ideas at all is something like them being definite in the sense of having definite outlines and being definable, right? So to be definable, to have an appropriate measure, and to be ideal-like or mathematical are almost synonyms in Plato. So what gives things the appropriate measure to be definitely intelligible is something like a beauty or fitness or good about them. And that beauty or fitness or good about them is what defines them enough to have a definition. Okay, and that is also what makes them a one, what makes them a stable through time, eternal entity, because they're defined, they're almost mathematically definable entity. They have a stable essence, if I can put it in those terms. So to have a stable essence, to be a one, and to have had appropriate, beautiful measure imparted to you by the aptness or fitness or goodness of the thing, are synonyms. And I think that's primarily what Plato means by "and the good is the one." But plenty of people afterwards read it in a much more theistic manner than that, right? They took him to be assimilating his good that is beyond being with the one, and they're saying, okay, so if this good is the one, and the good is beyond being, the one is beyond being. So Plato believes that there's a one beyond being, which is higher than being, and all of being is subordinate to. Well, that lines up perfectly with the first hypothesis of the Parmenides, where we have a one, which is not being and is above being. So people put together the conclusion of Plato's public lecture on the good with the first hypothesis of the Parmenides, and decided that the one that is the good that he is talking about is beyond being, is also just the same one that's talked about in the Parmenides. Who is the someone who is doing that? Plotinus. That is where Neoplatonism is going to come out. All these Middle Platonists along the way are people who aren't yet there. They're people who are wrestling with different parts of this and coming up with different versions of that. They're distinguishing between the being thing and the good thing, or the one thing, and they're not putting them together in the same way that Plotinus does. But Plotinus is the person who will make a neat hierarchy out of all this, right? Which we'll get to when we get to Plotinus. But Plotinus's claim to fame, Neoplatonism claim to fame, is to have made a neat metaphysical hierarchy out of all of these swirling ideas of good, one, mind, truth in Plato. Does that help?
Yeah, that really puts a lot of weight on Plotinus now.
Yes. Then you have to ask, but did he get it right? He certainly tried to, but did he get it right? Yeah, yeah, of course. Yes. So this is the drum roll for Plotinus. You know, no pressure, no pressure, right? Okay. So anything further in the actual Plato chapter? I wanted to bring out this one point, which I don't think Dee brings out. She mentions at one point, I think it's in a later chapter, she mentioned at one point that Plato presents this idea of the good as something which the philosophical mind tries to relate to directly without an intermediary. And she says somewhere without an intermediary. And that struck me because the whole doctrine of the symposium is that there isn't an intermediary. The intermediary is love. This is something that later Christian doctrine made much of. They would assimilate that necessary intermediary between the mind and the truth, or the mind and the good, or the mind and beauty, or the mind and God, as being a love intermediary. And the point is that's already there in Plato. That's not something that comes in with a particular doctrine about Christ, right? That's something that's already, or in John or something, that's already there in Plato. Okay.
How that's in the hierarchy compared to the one. So that's where I start to get confused.
Right. So this is the thing. In Plato, it sits way under the one. It sits way under beauty. It's a way less than highest God intermediary, but it is presented as a semi-personal divine being. Why? Because they're talking about the Greek god Eros, right? And everybody at the banquet has to give their speech praising Eros. That's the drinking game, right? And you know, Aristophanes gives one where he tells us how everyone was split in half, and we used to be
We need to have one of those.
4 arms and 4 legs and roll around on all sides, but then now we got split in half, and now we all long for other half, right? And that's his explanation of longing. But
One of those games.
yes, we definitely need to have a symposium reading drinking party. But we have to get an Alcibiades to come in drunk in the middle of it and disrupt everything. But anyway,
Was it Jacob? We could get Jacob.
yes, that might work. Okay, so anyway, I wanted to get all of those points about Plato out. I think Dee did a good job on most of them, but not all. The other thing I want to hype here is there's a change that happens between Plato, and it's not clear where. Some of the Middle Platonists have already done this reversal, partly under the influence of Aristotle. It's certainly there in some of the Christians, but there's a weird reversal that happens. And what do I mean by the weird reversal? The weird reversal is that for Plato to be outside of time, transcendent, is the same as to be more intelligible and more definite. Whereas to be inside time, to be indeterminate, to be infinite, to be fuzzy, and to be unintelligible are together, assimilated for Plato, right? And that means, from Plato's point of view, to say that something is infinite is a demerit, right? You get one demerit for being infinite because you don't have a proper definition, and therefore you're not properly eternal, right? Whereas after him, people say, oh, the fact that senses can't have anything to do with it because it has nothing, it never happens in time and has no actuality, means we can't know anything about it because we only know things through our senses and through actuality, right? So they think that something not being in time means that it can't be known. And they also, the later guys also think that something being finite means that it's simple and comprehensible, well, perhaps, but something being infinite means that it's awesome and powerful and more important. So to be infinite is to be more important and more divine, and to be incomprehensible is the same as to have no actuality. So the intelligibility sign, so to speak, of being finite and in time completely flips, right? They both agree that the infinite has an element of incomprehensibility to it, but to Plato that's a demerit, and to the certainly with the people influenced by the biblical tradition, it's a merit, and to some of these others along the way perhaps as well, and then to be something that you could have any in-time interaction with advances the intelligibility of something to anyone who's an Aristotelian and thinks that actuality is a thing you can understand, but not a Platonist who thinks that something is in time, it's probably changing and moving around on you. It isn't stable enough that it will lock down and sit under your concept where you're trying to reason about it. You can't do math about things in time. The things that could actually happen in time are probably all squirrely and moving around, and your concept nets don't actually fit over them, right? So for something to be empirical is to Plato the same as saying it's harder to understand. But a lot of these people are treating the fact that you can't understand God as the reason you can't understand God is because there's nothing empirical about it, right? So how understandable is body? That's the fundamental thing they're disagreeing about. Plato thinks that body has something indefinite and material and ununderstandable about it. And certainly the Stoics all think that if something is material, it's understandable. And if it's not, it's probably not. So there's a changing, keep track with all these people about the knowability and importance, valence, so to speak, or value they give to being in time or being empirically accessible on the one hand, and being infinite on the other. Because many of the disagreements with Plato are coming from flipping those around, if that makes sense.
How do they distinguish the difference between the infinity and the eternal? That's what to me, that's almost like.
Yes. So to Plato, he's reading infinite incredibly literally. Infinite means not having boundaries. So it doesn't mean to him more massive than the universe. It means fuzzy. It means soft and mushy. It means doesn't sit in one place. It means squirrely, right? And that to him exactly characterizes everything material. Everything matter-like has this notion of indefiniteness. To him, matter is exactly what can be formed, but because it can take on any form, it doesn't really have any form on its own. The forms have intelligibility to them. The forms are nice and mathematical and geometrical, but the things which are being formed, the squishy matter squishes around in every possible way, and it's just indefinite and infinite and incomprehensible.
Which is why he says, no one ignorant of geometry enter here.
Yes, he doesn't say no one entered into physics enter here. He says no one entered into geometry enter here, right? Geometry is comprehensible, and what's the fundamental difference between the Platonists and the Aristotelians there? I mean, Aristotle, all do credit codified logic. They're Platonists are entirely with him, but he also spent a bunch of time studying animals, right? Biology. He invented biology, right? The squishiest subject imaginable, right? From the standpoint of a Platonist, right? Where nothing seems to be stable and everything bleeds into one another, and et cetera. Okay. So anyway, the point is track whether or not they treat infinite as a term of praise. It will tell you how near or far they have gone from the Platonic idea that the finite is comprehensible and the infinite is not.
That's awesome. Lights are going. The lights are coming on. Yeah. Okay. So much stuff. It's just really coming together. Thank you. It's excellent.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered the Plato chapter. We had briefly already talked about the Neo-Pythagorean arrival and why it came about, but I want to just go over this little diagram on page 39. He also talks in this section about, that is D talks about Plato's lecture on the good, because this is connected to the Neo-Pythagorean revival. There were lots of people who didn't like the good is the one conclusion of the lecture. But if you just turn to page 39 for a second, you get this point, line, plane, solid, one, dyad, triad, tetrad, nous, episteme, doxa, athesis, right? And so there's a Greek translation for you. Mind, that's the nous part. Episteme is knowledge, doxa is opinion, and athesis is sensibility. So the point, the one, and mind are being assimilated. The line, the two, and knowledge, weirdly, are being assimilated. The plane, the triad, and opinion are being assimilated, and the solid, four, and sensibility are being assimilated. Joe, do you have a question? You're on mute. I don't know if you're talking to someone else. Yes, no? I was asking Joe if you were speaking. I think you're talking to someone else in the room or something.
That's correct. I was dealing with the conversation, and I was still paying attention, but I was not focused.
Understood.
Sorry.
So
did you ask me a question?
Only if you wanted to talk. I couldn't tell if you were trying to talk to us and you just didn't know you were on mute, but you were talking to someone else in the room. Not a problem.
Okay.
So the section on page 39 where he gives us 1, 2, 3, 4 with the number of dimensions and some conceptual thing that's being attached to it. This is a perfect example of what the Neo-Pythagoreans were doing, right? This is a Neo-Pythagorean kind of thing to do. And one of the things that Dee is pointing out here is that this particular example of it is actually taken from Aristotle in De Anima, which is his work on the soul, right? So this may sound like it's this, weird Neo-Pythagorean thing of reading number and everything, but Aristotle himself does it in some of his, classic works, right? So what's the point of that? The point of that is just that this tendency to see this number-like aspect in things wasn't limited to just a few wacky Pythagoreans. It was something that Plato did and something that Aristotle did as well. Okay. But he calls this the Pythagorean of Plato. And what's the point of this? The point of this is there's mention from the third-party sources that in his lecture on the good, he was going into all these mathematical facts where he's trying to substantiate that this oneness is what conveys being and goodness on the intelligibles or something like that, that nobody, and most of the people in the audience didn't comprehend at all, right? And the point she's sort of hinting at, but is kind of left out here, is that this reinforces the Pythagoreans among the Platonists, right? It's evidence that in at least one public lecture that we don't have as a surviving dialogue, Plato was Pythagoreanizing, mathematizing about the nature of the good, something like that. Okay. He says, realistically, the one of the lecture cannot without distortion be identified with the one described in the first hypothesis of Parmenides, although it didn't develop in this direction, that does not become fully explicit till Plotinus. So this is the point we were making before about how it's Plotinus who, drumroll, tries to bring all this together in this consistent way. That's Dee's thesis as well on page 40. Okay. So any questions about the other characters in this chapter 2 on the Neo-Pythagorean revival?
I only had one question. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm completely dominating it. Anybody else jump in?
No, please go.
Okay, so on page 45, I just had a note to ask this question, and that was, I wanted to see the first hypothesis of Parmenides to compare and contrast with, I always say it wrong,
Speusippus.
Yes.
I can't pronounce it either.
Yeah, Speusippus. There we go, Speusippus. So I was just interested in seeing that compared and contrasted with Speusippus. And I don't know if that happens, or if it did happen, I missed it. So I was wondering, and if it wasn't intended to be there, I wonder if we can. So
the thing that she's reacting to here is the stuff you went to on page 44, and the point is that Speusippus says that the one is not beyond being, outright, right? And not only that, the one cannot be called good. So to Speusippus is a logical deduction of the same kind you got in the Parmenides reasoning, that if something is one, it's neither good nor bad, right? It may be beyond good and bad, it may be indifferent to good and bad, but for the same reason that an original unity in Jung cannot be simply good, right? The one, according to Speusippus, is not simply good. And he also thinks that the one is on the level of being, because one and being correlate, whatever. The one above being is not good, right? So because good does not apply to it, basically. Neither does bad, but good certainly does not apply to it. So in that sense, Speusippus is still reasoning about something like a Parmenidean one, but he's not agreeing with later. He's not agreeing with the conclusion of the dialogue on the good, where Plato supposedly said the good is the one. Nor is he going to be agreeing with the Neoplatonic synthesis of all these things. How is this related to negative theology? Partly it's something like saying you cannot predicate goodness of the one. You're limiting it, right? You're giving it one inflection along an avenue of distinction, and the whole point of one is There are no distinctions. It's simple. Doesn't have good, doesn't have bad, doesn't have the direction good and bad, doesn't have an orientation in the direction good and bad. Neither good nor bad apply to it. It's above distinction. So that's Chrysippus's claim, and that therefore the one simply as one cannot be termed either being or good, has strong resonance with later thinkers such as Plotinus and his own immediate successors. Dee's point there is that this point was made by some of these neo-Pythagorizing Middle Platonists, and you get echoes of it later, especially when claims about unknowability, but it's not taken up by the people immediately around him, right? It's over their heads, so to speak. But his reasoning is based upon exactly the same. Why did the logic of that first argument that we saw in the first hypothesis go through? It went through because simplicity was the core thing. Simplicity is what is the thing from which you deduced that it was incorporeal. Simplicity was the thing from which you deduced it was outside time. Well, the same reasoning, according to Chrysippus, will deduce that it is outside good and bad. Good and bad are a distinction that would apply to it in exactly the same way that being in time would, or being in space would. And the same arguments that a simple thing cannot be in the good or bad field apply as that it cannot be in the spatial field, or it cannot be in the temporal field. No distinction applies to it. So the good or bad field doesn't apply to it. That's his reasoning. Does that make sense?
Why does he say that it? Why does he say that it does have being? I was persuaded by the original claim that something that exists in time has being every
Yes.
instant, and so it has multiple beings. So the time.
Right. So this relates to the fact that I tried to bring out when we went over the actual first hypothesis, that there's kind of two premises there. The second premise depends upon the notion that being is a time category word, right? But being is only a time category word if being only refers to actuality. If you allow for anything like a mathematical truth or a realm of the ideas that it's completely outside of time, then you can use being, maybe differently than use it for actuality, to refer to the eternal rather than simply present being of, say, the truth that 2 + 2 = 4, right? That doesn't exist in time. It's not affected by actuality. Does it make sense to deny being of it? Only if we want to restrict being to actuality, which we don't have to do, right? If we allow being to mean the same kind of eternal ever presence in the sense of outside time that 2 + 2 = 4 has, right? Then there's a meaningful sense of being that can be ascribed to something, even if it's completely unaffected by the category of time, which is exactly what the first hypothesis argument didn't allow, right? When he in the first hypothesis argument, he only used the notion of being that was within time. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but I guess I'm too modern to get that up front. You've explained it, thank you. But up front, I would think that a mathematical formula or a mathematical reality, even the Euclidean stuff, really only exists in the human mind when the human mind thinks about it. And therefore,
yes.
if it comes back and it sort of resurrects it and jumps in whenever you want it, but it doesn't. So it does have time because you can think about it today,
you're
think
thinking
about it tomorrow.
But you're thinking of the knowledge of it as the thing which is actually having time, right?
Oh, yeah, caught me, caught me.
Yes. So, and there are different versions of the reactions to that. Some of them will have, an eternal mind, a God mind, whatever, the mind of the universe mind, to which the eternal truths are eternally present. And in that sense, they will bridge it that way. But others aren't Aristotelian enough to give a tuppenny down about the actuality part. They don't need a mind to actualize it to think that it's real, because they do not equate being with actuality, right? Aristotelians do, Platonists don't. So the argument in the Parmenides is kind of before that distinction. It's sort of where we notice that distinction is necessary, right? But what notion of being do you use? If you use a notion of being in which something has to be articulated in time and has to have a present instantiation in order to be, then you're really using being to mean actuality. And then the notion of something being outside of time doesn't make any sense. But the Platonists reject this because to them it falsifies the truths about mathematical facts, right? Mathematical facts are outside of time. It's not that they have a present instantiation. they don't have a present instantiation, don't need a present instantiation. They're true in all possible worlds. So time has nothing to do with why they're true. That's the Platonist position and mine. But
Do they, you know, since abstract numbers are real, but they're not dependent upon sense perception
yes,
and the
therefore not
sense.
actual. Yes.
Right. Okay. Did anybody try to argue against that? So it's like a
Oh, lots of
phenomenon.
people. Every nominalist argues against that. Like William of Ockham argues against that, and some Aristotelians argue against that, and plenty of logical positivists at the turn of the century argue against that. There's lots of people who don't like the idea of having a notion of being that they can't immediately equate to actuality or empirical. They want to anchor being in something like actuality or empirical, and the Platonists are just why, right?
I did have one other thing that came to mind earlier, and I wanted to make the distinction with how this all works with Euthyphro's dilemma. And if I'm bringing in something that
I
doesn't
don't think Euthyphro's dilemma here fits here. I mean, I don't.
I was thinking about the good, you know, being above a demiurge.
Well, okay, yeah.
And
So yes, it's fair. We can bring it in this way, right? The Orthodox Platonist position / Socratic position is that good is above the gods. There's a standards we can even hold the gods to, right? And in that sense, it's metaphysically real above the gods. And they certainly don't think that there is any authority of gods defining what is good as what the gods like, right? In that sense, the Euthyphro argument that the gods are only godlike and good if they are in accordance with good, right, is just standard Platonic theology, so to speak. And the separate Euthyphroian position, as opposed to the Socratic position in that dialogue, that good is whatever the gods declare to be good. The position that would be typically assimilated here to would be something like a willful unknown God, which is usually a being God, not a good God position. I will be with what I shall be, right? That sort of unknowable fiat can change what is good, right? That's the sort of divine mystical authority of God sort of position that you might get in a Luther, and you would certainly get in an Occam, and you'd certainly get in a Ghazali or something like that. I don't know if that helps.
So I'm still thinking about, I'm trying to formulate in my mind hierarchies and understanding, you know.
Yes, in a Platonic hierarchy, the good above any individual God notion is there because if something, what is it? What's the principle of Platonic theology? The principle of Platonic theology is nothing worse than a good man deserves to be called God, right? This is the principle of the criticism of the poets in Plato's Republic. Why do we know that we can't let these Homer and the poets tell all their scandalous stories about Zeus, right? The answer is because we know that if a Zeus, any Zeus that did those scandalous things wouldn't deserve to be called Zeus, because Zeus is just Deus. It's just God in Greek, right? The Z's and the D's are just, you know, Indo-European interchangeable. Zeus is supposed to be Deus, is supposed to be God, and, you know, God isn't a rapist. So Homer is right out. That's sort of the argument for censoring the poets in like book 3 of Plato's Republic, right? And if you generalize that principle, you get this notion that nothing that is morally contemptible can ever be called divine. And that's also the principle of Euthyphro, that there's some principle of good which is above even what, you know, God's decree, something like that. Now you can ask how knowable those standards are, but you at least have empirical partial standard versions of it. Whereas the God can do whatever he wants, and it's good if he does it, position of the Ghazalis and Occams of the world considers that as an arrogance that derogates from the authority of God, something like that. And that's more in line with the position of Euthyphro the character rather than Euthyphro the dialogue in the distinction you brought up. Okay. And as I said, in terms of different versions of theology, it's usually not good theologies that come out that way. It's being theologies, especially unknowable, infinite being theologies, power theologies that come out that way. Okay. Right. How about 3 ones in moderates? Did anyone get that one? I like the idea that there's 3 ones. Why did he have 3 ones? The answer is the first, second, and third hypotheses get assimilated to what we would consider, what some later thinkers would consider like the moments of the procession from the one in Plotinus, or what you would consider persons of the Trinity in later Christian doctrine, right? There's the one which is completely above being and outside of time, and then there's the one that is present in all things, is something like their unity or principle of reason, right? And then to moderates, there's still a third one below that, which is something like soul or life, right? And each of those different ones, the one of outside of time, above time, the one of intelligible order in things, and the one of something like life or soul in things, is to him a different version of one. That's what she's going on to in 49 and 50. Why does this matter? This matters mostly because it shows us that in this Middle Platonic tradition, there were already people who were, for purely pagan philosophical reasons, moving in directions that later turned into something like Trinity doctrine, right? That wasn't something invented by Christians. It was already there as, you know, different moments or notions of something like a divine principle, or a principle of order in the universe, or something like that, or a principle of mind in the universe, that were mindliness. That if anyone tells you that those things only have a purely biblical origin, they're wrong, because we already find it, you know, even the Middle Platonists, let alone the Neoplatonists, right? They have an origin in metaphysical, philosophical speculation well before they have any specifically only biblical grounding. Okay. Okay, the next one, he talks about the corpus hermeticum, and we already talked about the hermesis when we were talking about the Gnostics. So I don't know how much we have to go into that, but there's one other thing I do want to bring out here, which is Celsus. This is in pages 60 to 66, because Celsus is a character that people have probably never heard of. How many people have heard of Celsus? Not Celsius, but Celsus. No one, right? I've heard of Celsus, but that's about it. So who is Celsus? Celsus is this guy who, when Christianity is a new thing at the very beginning of the 2nd century, or so, middle of the 2nd century, I guess he writes his book, writes a big long book called The True Account, or Aletheia Logos, right? The True Account of the True Discourse, which is, you know, goes back through Platonism and Greek myth and basically the whole classical tradition, and says, we already had all this stuff figured out, and the Christians are just mucking it up with their new stuff, right? That's the fundamental attitude Celsus has. And he's in some places assimilates the Gnostics and Christians to each other, and rejects them both as misunderstanding the truth about metaphysics, and the truth about the kernels of truth that are embedded in old pagan myth, which have been successfully extracted from them, or, you know, the truth arrived at by reasoning in the Platonic schools, and we already know all the truth about the deity and so forth, and we know that from Platonic philosophy, etc. And we don't need any of this newfangled Gnostic and Christian stuff mucking up the works and making a hash of it. That's the fundamental position of Celsus, right? And he writes a giant book on this, which is like sustained polemic against Christianity and Gnosticism. And in some places, you know, straw man versions of Christianity and Gnosticism, he finds the weakest positions and, you know, assaults those instead of the strongest positions, right? He's a polemicist. He's not necessarily engaging with the strength of his opponent, honestly. And then Origen writes this giant book, right? Contra Celsus, against Celsus, which is his giant refutation of it. And by the way, this is the only reason we know Celsus lived, right? This book, right? It's one of those things that there's a argument we came across in the Gnostics. He says that how did the Jews deal with heresy? Silence. You just didn't talk about them. Whereas the Christian church fathers, give these long books, the refutation of all heresy, and you can find every heresy in them, right? So the point is that one good way to spread heresy is to write giant books against them and put them in the authoritative libraries of the church fathers that everyone has, because then everybody who wants to can go to the library and find out all about that heresy on chapter 64, right? But anyway, this is something like that. But in the sustained polemics of the time, it's necessary because you don't even know that you're going to win without it. But what am I trying to say? Oregon is a kind of Platonist Christian, very learned. He knows all of Celsus's arguments. He's kind of outraged at the flippancy with which Celsus is dismissing Christianity. He kind of agrees with them on some of the ways that he is flippantly dismissing some of the Gnostics, right? But so he's going to find some common ground with them. But anyway, if you want to know what a second century flame war from at the highest levels looked like, read this book, right? It's a ripper. But that's Celsus, right? And it's important to know people like Celsus were around, because some people think that Gibbon came up with these kind of arguments. No, he did not. Or that it was Julian the Apostate. No, he was completely ham-fisted as intellectual and had no thoughts to his name, right? No, it's Celsus. If you want to find the early pagan philosophical critique of Christianity from the pagan philosopher's point of view, right? The place you'll find it is in Celsus. And the only place you'll find Celsus is Oregon taking him down, right? Anyway, just he's one of the most interesting characters that comes up in this chapter. And Dee is only interested in the variants of Platonism that she finds in him. And what she finds is that he Celsus, has a very dark, unknowable version of the highest God, which to Dee means that he is influenced, maybe even against his own understanding or wishes, not only by people like Numinus before him, but also by the Gnostics around him, right? A God that isn't transcendental enough, or a God that is too knowable, isn't a very convincing God in the middle of the 2nd century, in the middle of these debates. So Celsus's version of Platonism has a quite dark, relatively unknowable God compared to the befores and the afters. And that's of interest to Dee because it's a place where you get this another point of kind of negative theology, or kind of stressing the ineffability of God, right? In this case, from the pagan Platonic point of view. The Christians claim to know too much about God, and they claim to know things about the incarnation, which we Platonists know are unknowable, or something like that. That's the kind of arguments being made. Anyway, anyone else catch up on that Celsus stuff?
Yeah, and I had a couple questions specifically about him.
Yes.
The first one's from page 65.
Yep.
Question was, if Celsus is the first pre-Platonian thinker to articulate a God who transcends both ousia and nous, hope I pronounced that right.
Nous.
What was his, yeah, okay. What was his issue with Christianity? Question mark. Since Christianity also states that God is ultimately unknowable in this plane of existence, the physical, but may be fully known only in the non-physical realm after death. So I'm just trying to understand
right.
Why.
So the fundamental problem that Celsus has with the Christians is the incarnation.
Okay.
Right. I mean, true God is above being and mind, right? Unknowable and above being and mind. So he wasn't born in Palestine in 0 AD or 4 BC, right? That's Celsus's fundamental position, right? That may not be disagreeing with them about the highest order of the Godhead, but his argument against them is not that much different from what the argument of Muhammad would be against it, right? You have derogated from the unity and unknowability and transcendence of God by making him a fisherman. Okay.
Okay, that's simple. I thought it was.
It's not that complicated. It's not that they have a different, this is remember we were reading Gilson. I was saying he gives all these arguments against someone's particular theological notions, and I mentioned that that's not an argument against Christianity. It's an argument Judaism or Mohammedanism because the incarnation, violates it, right? That same kind of thing is going on here. Celsus is saying the pagans have already figured out the transcendent God, and so it's not news, it's not gospel good news to be told about a transcendent God, which you already knew about, but being the incarnation stories about him are not credible to Celsus, right? Yeah, so you can read more about it in Oregon and his particular ways in which he thinks Celsus takes cheap shots and all that kind of stuff. But if you want chapter and verse, read against Celsus.
Okay. And then I had page 66.
Yes.
I had one question after reading through that, and it was explicating God as the cause of Usa and Nu. Does this mean that Celsus and Maximus presupposed linear time in the transcendent?
No, they don't mean cause in that sense. They don't mean cause in the cause in time forward pushing sense. They mean cause in the metaphysical support of being, in the sense of this other thing is a subsists within or is an emanation from this other, which you also get in a more elaborated form in Plotinus, but that notion is already there, and it's certainly not direct forward causation in time. The only person who cares about these God questions with direct forward causation in time is Aristotle, where he makes first cause arguments, right? The Platonists don't make first cause arguments. They make, descendant from a higher principle of, rational being or something like that arguments, which are all hierarchy down. They're not, older in time, pushing forward kind of arguments.
They're on an ontological plane, not a
not a physical causation plane.
Right.
Aristotle is distinctive for having this, earlier in time cause argument, which is actually revived considerably in the scholastic period by Aquinas. Aquinas thinks that there's lots of different arguments for the existence of God, and they all have their different merits and so forth. And some may tell you more about God's nature than others, but the one which is hardest to refute as a matter of pure logic, he thinks is the first cause argument from Aristotle, and that's why he's an Aristotelian. That's something which you get much later, and it's well, the argument you get in Aristotle quite early, but the upgrading of it over the other theological arguments only happens very late, when Aristotelianism is being brought back into the Catholic Church by people like Aquinas. Excellent question.
Yeah, okay. I did go back and look, and I did discover that I have a 20-year-old copy of the True Doctrine that was reconstructed.
Oh, wonderful.
To be there as a True Doctrine, and I did find Contra Celsus too. I've been doing some sorting, and so it kind of rang a bell with me, and it's quite fascinating the arguments that they just get blistered, but actually were very reasonable arguments.
Yes, I mean they're definitely going out hammer and tongs, but many of the arguments are quite reasonable. I mean, there are places where they are willing to take cheap shots and so forth, or arguing straw men, but there's many presentations of the history of how Christianity culturally superseded pagan civilization that present it as having occurred without any rational argument. Nothing could be farther from the truth, right? There were very learned arguments at the peak level with very strong bolts being thrown by both sides, and the Christians won the argument, culturally speaking. It wasn't that there was no one arguing on the other side. It wasn't because it was given fashion won through the back door by just convincing the wise. Nothing like that happened, right? It was a peak argument among extremely culturally informed people at the highest levels of learning, right? And does that mean that everyone who decided the question one way or another decided that way because of the merits of that argument at the peak levels? Absolutely not. But the argument at the peak levels occurred, and it was not in any way a one-sided one. And in that whole argument, people like Origen and Gregory of Nyssa and Augustine, came out on top of the Celsuses and Julian the Apostates of the world. Okay.
I think some of the arguments are being revisited in modern times.
Absolutely. None of these things are ever final in the sense of finally settled. They're settled at a cultural moment for a particular civilization or a particular time. But the reason it's worth reading these things is these arguments are way deeper and way more eternal than that. They have their cultural moment, but they're never alive and exactly the same for today, but they rhyme, as they say about history. Okay. The corpus hermeticum, right? So this has gone over very quickly. We've talked about it before in the other section, but it's important to remember that the Hermetic position is not simply Gnostic. There are Gnostics within it, but there's others that are not. And the fundamental thing that I find in the Hermeticists that you don't find so much here is there's way more sympathy with pantheism, whether Stoic or materialist or otherwise, in the Hermetic doctrine than you get in certainly the Gnostics, and also perhaps then some of the Neoplatonists. The other thing I noticed is there's things on 67, which she points out as being, she says she finds these as echoes of things that she finds later in Scottish Eriugena in the 9th century. But those things that she's pointing out there aren't just from the Hermetic corpus. They're also they go all the way back to Heraclitus, this thing about the hidden God who is manifest in things and so forth. This is exactly the language that Heraclitus used to speak about the Logos, and it's was assimilated by the Stoics into their Logos doctrine. So those things are a way older Greek philosophical tradition than something just invented by the Hermetics. One other point I want to make about the Hermetics, it comes back to other places later. The Hermetics were one of these groups that was doing this thing of claiming that their doctrine had to be true because it was older. They're backdating their sources, right? That we can tell from the content of the doctrines that they're 2nd and 3rd century, mostly 3rd century AD, right? And originating in Egypt, but from mostly Greek sources. But what they purport to be on their face is, the ancient wisdom of the Egyptians, right? This is supposed to be ancient Egyptian doctrine that's been, was hidden in their myths and has been, rediscovered by, modern thinkers who have ferreted it out. We're going to see more of that. You get that also in people like Iambelicus. He's a Neoplatonist who, talks about the Egyptian and Chaldean mysteries. There's, things about the Chaldean oracles running around at the time. The other version of it we're going to see, though, is Dionysius the Areopagite, because he's probably writing at the end of the 400s, beginning of the 500s, but he backdates everything to the 1st century AD in order to claim that these are the secret doctrines or teachings of the Dionysius with whom Paul conversed in Athens when he went to Athens. That's why he's called the Areopagite, right? He's claiming that he was the actual Dionysius that was discussed conversion in Acts when Paul went to Athens, right? And by dating his doctrines back to then, he could make them seem way more apostolic canonical than they probably were, right? Because there's lots of elements of it that are importing elements of Neoplatonism. And if he can say, actually, that was there as a Christian thing already in the 1st century AD, then nobody is worried about how foreign it might be to the body of Christian doctrine. And that was for centuries, a successful imposition, so to speak. People thought that this was, at least most people thought that this was the works of a 1st century Christian philosopher, when it was actually the work of a 5th century Christian philosopher. It was still the work of a Christian philosopher, but he backdated himself 300 years, or put his own doctrine into the mouths of a famous historical character out of Acts in order to get greater purchase for his arguments. Okay.
May I inquire on Heraclitus? I saw that reference.
Yes.
And I thought to myself again, what didn't I know? And what is there to be known? I had known that Heraclitus was involved in what I thought was the first philosophical or Greek mention of logos. But was he also a person who had a set of doctrines, a set of teachings.
Yes. So I mean, he's famous as the, you know, fluxus philosopher, as the all is change philosopher, the philosopher of becoming, as opposed to the philosopher of being beside Parmenides. But and he has a famously, you know, elliptical oracular style with these very terse, dense statements with lots of double entendres in them. It's hard to read, so it's very hard to figure out exactly what he meant. He's therefore earned the epithet Heraclitus the Obscure, but he still thought of himself as teaching a particular doctrine. I can rattle off by heart his most famous single teaching, which is, you know, along the lines of as obscure as the statement about the Tao that cannot be said, right? Or that can be said, right? Heraclitus says, listening not to me, but to the Logos, wise is agreement, which is same saying, all is one. Right? So this is the oracular statement, right? Listening not to me, but to the Logos. Wise is homolegen. Wise is same saying, saying along with the Logos. All is one, right? So that's a typical Heraclitean oracular statement from the, you know, 400s BC. That is what else he says? He says nature loves to hide. He also says, how can they hide from that which never sets? Or he's thinking of being or truth. So these are these, you know, oracular statements where you have to see the point in them, to you have to read into them. He wants you to philosophize in the same way that some Taoist sayings are, right, or Buddhist sayings for that matter. You have to see the point in them to see the depth in them. He writes that way.
So did Heraclitus have a following? Was he refuted in the academy? Was
he had a following in the sense that a lot of the physical scientist types considered him, you know, head of their school, so to speak. They considered him the philosopher of flux or of change. Plato has his Parmenidean stranger in the Sophists present there as being two armies: the armies of those who think that all is matter and those who believe in a mind or life superior to matter. And he puts Homer at the head of the matter camp, and he put Heraclitus as one of his generals. Right? He's part of the he's one of the generals of the believing in becoming rather than being in the material world and the immanent logical reason order of the material world, kind of philosophers that, you know, he's assimilated with people like Protagoras and people like Homer in Plato. Now, does he have a long following after that? Not by people who particularly call themselves Heracliteans, but certainly by you can certainly see his influence on both the Epicurean school and the Stoic school. So I would say not everyone would agree about his influence on Stoicism, but I think certainly the logic doctrines you get in Stoicism, not logic doctrines, the Logos doctrines as a reason immanent in the world, I consider heavily indebted to Heraclitus and his, listening not to me, but to the Logos. Yeah. Fine question. I think we did a session several years ago on a little book on Heraclitus where we went over that. Maybe it was one of the ones actually on, who am I thinking of? Polish philosopher Kolakowski. Kolakowski had a little book on vignettes of different philosophers, and he had a chapter on Heraclitus, and I think we discussed that in one of our previous meetups. Like it was several years ago. Okay, fine question. I hope that helps. We're almost at the end of this, but I want to just point out the last sentence of chapter 70, fundamentally important. And this is, I think it's actually a quote from Celsus, but no, it's not from Celsus. It's just saying Celsus is close. This is from the Hermetica, right? It says, of whom no words can tell, no tongue can speak, whom silence only can declare. That's their statement about transcendent God. So this is getting at ineffability and whom silence only can declare. Can anyone else think of a more recent philosopher who also said something about of what you cannot speak, it is necessary to remain silent. If it didn't give it away.
Wittgenstein, you just gave it away.
Exactly. So the point is that there's elements of a mystical note in Wittgenstein, which are echoing some of this Hermetic tradition version of the unspeakable, so to speak. Okay, I think we've made it through chapter 3. We haven't gotten to everyone's questions yet. We've made it through chapter 3. The A guy and the N guy, as we were talked about before, that's Alcinous and Numinous, are in chapter 4. This is 2nd century Middle Platonism. So this is Platonism, which is between Middle and Neo. It's Platonism, which is around the same time as the Gnostic perspective last time. And he throws in Basilides in the middle of the chapter. Basilides, we may remember from the Gnostics stuff because he's a Gnostic, no, flat out, right? No question. So what's going on here? This chapter is giving everything that's pre-Plotinus, post beginning of Christianity, right? In really the 2nd century. So not only are the Christians around, but they have philosophers like Clement of Alexandria running around talking about what they think, and earlier fathers like Irenaeus. The Gnostics are running around as well. And so there's, yeah, it's not really becoming a terribly live issue to debate the Christians yet, but kind of is. I mean, Celsus has already happened. What do we get? We get father and maker. We get reading meaning into the name Apollo in a Pythagorean way, which we can talk about. They're getting more and more versions of more and more transcendent gods in the Platonic tradition, if I can put it that way. Partly under the pressure of, if I can put it this way, competition with the Gnostics and the Christians, for all the reasons we saw in our Gnostic discussion previously. But before we get to, first of all, there's just the fact that Basilides is sitting here in the middle of this. He's not simply a Platonist. He's definitely disagreeing with the Platonists, but he's here in part because he's the not being God, right? He's not just a not knowable God. He's not just a God, he says, above being. It's the not being God. It's the God that isn't even ineffable, right? So that's one of the reasons that he's in this chapter. This chapter is kind of all of the more and more transcendent notions of God that you're getting from the pagan traditions before Plotinus. Okay. So I want to quickly just talk about the Apollo idea. Did everyone follow this Apollo idea? Because it's, if you don't get the etymology, it's very obscure. Apollo, right? It's obviously a traditional Greek god, but it also was given this etymology, this explanation of how the word was put together by people in this school around this time in the 2nd century, right? There may be some precursors of it in some Pythagoreans who had the same thought before, but these are the guys who make the most of it. Apollo is an A privative, just like you put an A in front of something in Greek and you say it's not this. And the second part is read as poly, right? The Apollo of the second half of poly is many, not many. So the claim is that the word Apollo is as a name for a god is saying the one as the not many, as the has no many applied to it, as the simple of the first hypotheses of the Parmenides, right? The first hypothesis is about a simple, which is a not many, and the not many is just another word for the one, right? So this is an etymology given for Apollo by people in this school to say, see, the ancient Greeks already had these hidden metaphysical doctrines hidden even in the names of their gods, even if the popular superstitious didn't know anything about them, right? The person who came up with a name knew something about it. That's why he said the name of this god is not many. Question.
I have a ton of them for this chapter, but it wasn't specifically
About that one.
Yeah, it was mostly about Alcinous or Alcinous, however you pronounce it correctly.
I always pronounce it with like it's a K because I never know how to pronounce a C except as a K when it's a Greek. So I say Alcinous.
Okay, and then there's also about Numinous, but later I'll
Fine. Let's go to your questions, right? Let's go to Alcinous.
Okay, so the first one was on page 74.
Yes.
And my question was, why would Alchemists place beauty above the good, as I alluded to earlier?
He's not putting it above the good, he's putting it on the level of the good.
Okay.
I mean, he
How
said,
can you do that?
she says that the implied elevation, the beauty of the good is unusual, would not mean anything else in the Middle Platonists when I'm concerned, right? But explicitly plays first role in beauty. I think the reason for that is if you read the Symposium, beauty and good are practically assimilated to one another in the Symposium. So I think that I don't think Alchemist's levels are beauty, intellect, and soul. So I think that beauty and good to him are correlate terms that basically the same thing. He's putting intellect below beauty and good, and he's putting soul below intellect, right? So, and by the way, other things will go at the level of intellect would be the intelligibles, intelligibility, mind, truth, something like that. Both of those are being put at the level of also being, intellect, mind, nous, truth. All of those are being put at level 2. At level 1, he's got beauty and good together, I would say. And below the level of intellect, he's putting soul and life, something like that. I think that's his actual hierarchy. I don't think that beauty is being put above the good. I think it's being stressed more than the good because he's definitely putting beauty above nous. But I consider that as putting beauty in the same place as good, not above it. He doesn't mention good in his hierarchy at all. So beauty has taken its place rather than having subordinated it. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, he's just trying to, it seems like because the Symposium was stressing that, he was trying to keep the vocabulary consistent with what the equated to the good there. Okay.
I think it's also because he thinks that beauty is more, is at this point a more Platonic, logical, what the concept is actually doing version of it than good is. What am I trying to say? The way that good gets to be above being in the Republic is something like it is that which lends the intelligibility and appropriate measure to all things. But the appropriate measureness aspect of good and the beauty idea are pretty damn close in Plato originally. And I just think that that's what Alchemist is harping on, right? And in part, he's doing that to try to make the notion more comprehensible than it would be if he didn't use the word beauty.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so second question is on page 75, right next to it.
Yes.
I was asking if D. Carabine is setting up Alchemist as the first Middle Platonist to hint at positive theology in the 2nd century. Because it seems like she started to go with, he had affirmative statements.
He does.
And
I don't know if he's the only positive one, though. I mean, because this is a whole book that's selecting only people who impact negative theology. All the positive guys are not there, right? Clement isn't here. Origen isn't here, right? Aristotle isn't here, right? There's plenty of people who might, make positive statements. I mean, Aristotle gives you a whole version of metaphysics in which, he tells you that God is nous, nousing nous, thought thinking itself, right? Positive statement, right? Not in the book. I think that's just a selection. It's not saying that this is the only person who said something positive. It's unusual that someone who's making positive statements instead of negative statements is in the book at all, but he's in the book because he's in this 2nd century Platonism period. And there are some elements of what he's doing that are about negative theology. The other thing you notice here is the prime mover of Aristotle is kind of be identified with the supreme deity of Alchemist. That's the most characteristically strange thing. Well, not strange. That's what in Alchemist makes him least like the other Platonists, right? He's got a first mover Aristotle demiurge creator in his God position, and that's not something you normally get from the Platonists, right? But his reason for that is, he's using the terms father and creator of all for God, right? So that means he has assimilated the demiurge of the Timaeus with the Platonic God and the prime mover of Aristotle. He's tied those together into one thing, and which is something you normally get from the Christian fathers, for example. but he's doing it as a Platonist.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Cool. I have two more that before page 96, if that's okay,
go for it.
because they're right in the same area. So page 77.
Yep.
Why would Alchemists revolt against Pythagorean and Platonism?
Sorry, where are you?
Page 77.
I know, where on the
where,
page?
I think it's a,
Talking about is the fact he doesn't use the word one.
yeah, it's interesting. Second chapter, a second paragraph.
Paragraph.
Interestingly, in this passage. Yep.
He does not refer to one, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't
I
say
suggest that
tohen.
one answer to this question could be that the dogmatic Platonists of the 2nd century may have been rebelling against the Pythagoreization of Platonism. For Alchemists in particular, the religious aspect of Neo-Pythagoreanism may well have been the reason for this. The God of
Yes.
Alchemists is not generally understood to be a personal God, but a metaphysical principle. So my question was, why
What
would
she's-
he revolt against
Right.
Pythagorean?
What she's suggesting there is that the Pythagoreans who are stressing all the ways in which Platonism isn't like Stoicism and isn't like Pythagoreanism even. Isn't not Pythagoreanism. Isn't like Stoicism and isn't like Aristotle. Right. That's what the Pythagoreans were doing. He doesn't want to do that because he's assimilating him to Aristotle. That's one. And secondly, she's reading him as someone who is committed to a kind of rationalist metaphysical principles only philosophical view of these things that wants to get away from any wonder-working mystagogy that she's reading here. He sense or smells in the Pythagoreans, right? I don't know if that's true. That's Dee's own diagnosis. She's thinking that Alchemist is trying to be a kind of determinate rationalist. I think that's a pretty heroic read. I think that he mostly wants to assimilate his Platonic God notions to an Aristotelian first cause God. I don't think that makes him not deist, at least, maybe less theist, but deist at least. I don't think that he has any particular anti-religious animus here. I think that she sees that, she's reading it in. I think that Protagoras might have an argument like that. I don't see Alchemist making an argument like that. Alchemist is arguing for a pretty straightforward Aristotelian God.
Okay. All righty.
Yeah, fine
Thank you.
question.
I had one last one, and this is the one about the translations.
Yes.
And that was where Semyon is translated here as translated as miracle or sign as used in the New Testament, because I also don't have an ancient Greek lexicon
Yes.
at my disposal. So I was trying to figure out what that word meant here.
I mean,
if it's different.
It would normally mean symbol or marker of meaning, right? I mean, but this is the point that this is the word he's actually using for point, right? He's not using it to mean something other than point. It's just he's not using the word monadius to indicate point. That's the thing she notices. Some people would say, the one, they're using a word for one to indicate point, and that's a particular Pythagorean thing to do, right? And he's deliberately not being Pythagorean. He's not using a word for point that includes the notion of one in it. He's using a word for point that just uses the word for sign and doesn't use the word for one.
I get you. Further distinction from the Pythagorean. Got it.
Yes.
All right. Okay.
Yes. Because the Pythagoreans would say point and one are assimilated notions. One, zero, we would say zero dimensional, but associated with the number one, and he's picking a different word for point that also means point, but is the word for point that comes from sign, not the word from point that comes from one.
Right. He wasn't trying to allude to some mystical miracle thing. He was just trying to make sure he just was distinguishing himself from
Yes.
the Pythagoreans.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
He's trying to not
Cool.
insinuate a notion of one into something where he's trying to be just a geometric term.
All righty. Gotcha.
Okay. Excellent question. Okay. So there's a whole bunch more on Alcibiades and Numinous. So the fundamental thing about Numinous is that Numinous is anticipating a bunch of things which we're going to see in Plotinus, especially in this mystical ascent thing. He numinous is the guy who's going to bring up the lecture on the good and agree with the good is one thing instead of finding it problematic. Some people question whether or not he's influenced by Jewish sources or Philo, but I don't think there's any necessary evidence for that. I agree with D on that. There isn't evidence for that. Okay. The one thing is that we find in numinous particularly is this emphasis on the incorporeal, right? The terms have shifted from the understandable or the noumenal realm or the beyond being realm that you might find in Plato or the good. It's shifted to the incorporeal. That is the fundamental thing, right? And why does this matter? Because incorporeal is going to be a point of agreement between the Platonists and the biblical tradition, so to speak, right? The Jewish doctrine will also insist on always reading the Old Testament without implying corporeality to God, even the places which seem to speak of God as corporeal. You'll get this in Maimonides later, or you get it in Philo around the same time. So what's the point here? The point here is that the fact that incorporeal has been elevated is to the status of what is the intelligible and truly existent. There are elements of that which do hark all the way back to Plato, but there's also elements of it which are they're assimilating that Platonic position to ambient Philo-like biblical theory, if I can put it that way. Okay. Right. The question is what's knowable, and the answer is that the creation is slightly knowable, but the first God, the first nous, beauty itself are entirely unknowable. Why does that matter? Numinous is agreeing with the Gnostic distinction between the unknowable highest God and the knowable creator God. And that principle you find in Gnosticism, numinous is also saying, oh, we had that in Plato too, right? Because the God of the Timaeus was somewhat knowable, because he said it was hard to know it, but he didn't say it was impossible to know it. It was impossible to teach everybody about it, but it was hard to know it. What's not being stressed there is that it's numinous, not Plato, who's saying that the higher God is not knowable, right? You don't find Plato saying that beauty in itself is entirely unknowable. That's numinous, right? So we're already to this point where claiming that the highest God is unknowable is now a point of distinction in his favor. He's more of a God because he's more transcendent if he's completely unknowable. That's new. That's a note which has come in with the Gnostics. It's a note which has come in with the Christians, and it's not a note that was there in the original Plato particularly. Okay. All right. I've gotten the main expositions I wanted to do, except I want to quickly talk back about Basilides a little bit, and the not being God, right? I think D is mostly on point in this section, where she's basically trying to say that Basilides' reasons for his various rulings on things is not fundamentally Platonic, it's fundamentally Gnostic. And many of his statements should be interpreted as Gnostic in origin and motivation, because you can tell he's going to come out that way because he's going to stick a finger in the eye of Judaism. Right? Basilides is of that Gnostic school that sees the creator God of Jewish tradition as being a far less than God, right? And he's. Let's just talk a little about background for. Oh, we lost Jim's connection. Background for Basilides. Basilides.
Here.
Are you back? Yeah. Basilides. Gotcha. He is a follower of Meander, who was a follower of Simon Magus. So we're talking about someone who claims to be 2 generations removed from the original Gnostic, so to speak, of in the sense of the heretic of Acts, right? Simon Magus. He says that he studied in Persia, right? So this is assimilating him slightly to the stuff which later comes out as Manian Zoroastrianism and its influences on Gnosticism. Okay, but that's sort of where he's coming out of. He's influenced by Alexandrian Platonism of his, not Neoplatonism of his time, but he's more influenced by the Gnostics themselves. D points out that there's a mystery because Irenaeus and Hippolytus ascribe different doctrines to Basilides. I think it's almost completely clear that it's Hippolytus that's right about that, and Irenaeus who's relatively misinformed. Right, Irenaeus is much closer in time and might not be reacting to the true doctrines of Basilides, as opposed to the reports about him. And it's almost, to me at least, almost completely clear that Hippolytus has got the right Basilides. Okay, that's something scholars themselves have not settled. It's not sure if they're talking about the same guy, but I think they are. And it's just that Irenaeus doesn't quite have his number yet, and Hippolytus does. By the way, if anyone wants to, there's a book by Hippolytus, one of the church fathers, definitely worth reading. It's called The Refutation of All Heresy. It's a great title for a book. It gives all of these linkages between various Gnostics and other heretics he doesn't like, with elements of pre-Socratic philosophy and other doctrines he thinks, other places they got their doctrines. He's basically just trying to show that these guys aren't really Christians. That's the point of the book. But in the course of doing that, he gives you a wonderful bestiary of all the critters running around the Mediterranean from, about from Simon Magus down to about 250 AD or so. It's a good book. It's a readable book. Okay. So Jim, you had mentioned before, there's this, these causation in time people, and Basilides is someone who has this imagination of the time before there is time as part of what he is thinking of. And we saw this already in the section on the Gnostics before about the original silence. The highest God was alone with only one companion, silence. Right, we saw that in Valentinian Gnosticism. So Basilides is similar, right? There is a nothingness which is not even ineffable, because ineffable is a name, right? So there's originally a not even ineffable original silence, and that is the situation of God alone. What is going on here? This is the old Gnostic thing of having to have God completely separated from the cosmos, right? So there's a time when there is only God and no cosmos. Therefore, the cosmos doesn't have anything godlike in it, because God would be God even if the cosmos never existed. Something like that. This is the typical Gnostic position that results in what D calls the non-being God. Okay. Right, and so D points out that he then equivocates on whether or not the Jewish God is effable or ineffable. Sometimes he says he's ineffable, right? But he's only ineffable, not even ineffable, right? And other times he'll say that the Jewish God is actually effable. I would submit to you that the distinction between those is that he's effable in his creation, at least. But there's a fundamental thing going on here, which is that it is not fundamentally Platonism which is motivating this Gnostic attack on the Jewish notion of God, right? What's in common is there's something like a God that is a creator in time that is not sufficiently transcendent. So the God of the Timaeus isn't the good beyond being, to put it in Platonic terms, but even more than that, a knowable creator God, knowable from his fingerprints in creation, isn't the truly transcendent God of the Gnostics. Anyway, any further questions about the Basilides section? No.
My only question was about numinous, so I'm waiting.
Okay, go ahead. Ask your question about numinous.
Okay, so I had one question about numinous. Sorry, last video. I thought it had a charging, but it has not. On page 96, he refers to the third creation, nature, the third God is creation.
Yes, father,
Um,
son, and grandson. Yes.
Yes, and I thought that is very interesting. I didn't know if this is like, is it because he's, excuse me, pagan, or like I didn't understand. Was he trying to incorporate paganism? Is he trying to incorporate the, uh, I guess what we'd say nature religions? Is he? I
Nope,
didn't.
nope, nope. I mean, he's thinking of uh, this is nous, demiurge, and world, right? So there's the highest God, mind God. Then there's the creator God who looks to the ideas to create the world, and then there's the world that is created. And the world that is created, Numinous does call a God, but that God is not the son; it's the grandson, right? So the cosmos, viewed as something which has an immanent order in it, that's something like a Stoic principle of the reason of the universe, or the order of the cosmos, right? There's something divine even in that simply that order of the world, that order of the cosmos. But that's a grandson God. It's not a highest God at all, right? It's a grandson God because it's made by the sun, which is the demiurge, and the sun itself is made by the highest uncreated God. So this is the Platonic version of the notion that the Jesus logos makes the world, right? But there's also some order in the world afterwards. That order in the world afterwards is being called the grandson. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks. I just was wondering because there were so many ideas thrown out.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and
Paganism,
it's unusual. It's something we're not used to. But what's going on here is that the father-son language is being used in a Platonic tradition that didn't use that language before. Right, we're in the 2nd century, so now a Platonist wants to explain to people who have heard father and son talk what the Platonists thought about all that, and the answer is the Anaxagoras mind that is the world mind, that is the highest God that creates the universe, is the Father, and the demiurge, the actual creator, the actual maker of the world, who only looks to the divine ideas as the pattern to determine what to make, is the Son. Right, and so far a Christian is sort of following along and saying, okay, I get that, I can line that up with my things. He says, and then the actual ordered universe, the cosmos that is created, is the grandson, because it's the work of the Son, and it has its own immanent order within it, just like the Stoics talk about their logos. But that immanent order logos within the world is the grandson. So instead of having a Holy Spirit, they have a grandson, which is the order of the cosmos. But this is how you're seeing that, by the 2nd century, even Platonists have trinities. They just have different terms in them. These streams are flowing together into a river, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, did that help with numinous?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Okay. All right. We've gotten through the basic text. We've also gone like 3 hours and change, but I know people had a bunch of questions about how you translate this, things which puzzled you along the way. I want to give everybody a chance to ask the specific questions. We can get to general assessments of any of it, but just the specific questions of I was confused about this, I didn't understand this person. We've covered a bunch of them along the way, but if anyone has things they've been holding out for, or you're bugged by how you translate that Greek term because it didn't make sense without knowing the translation, ask away. And speak up, because I can't see Jim to know who to call on. So just if you want to be called on, say so. I've already covered everything. Jim, I know you have questions, and you can jump in with your questions if nobody else speaks up. So
Yeah, I got like those main ones out, but I am my questions now. I see. But I don't want to get in the way of specifics for people.
no. Go ahead. Ask any question you want. People didn't jump in with specifics, so you're not jumping ahead of anybody with anything you want to ask. Just ask away.
Okay, so it got me thinking a lot about I'm because I've got Heidegger in my brain with the being and becoming, and even with Nietzsche talking about what becoming is, and those are some of the works we'd been involved with.
Sure.
I've just basically everything from Hegel up to Heidegger, and then of course we just Jonas.
Yes.
And now that I'm really getting this understanding, a much better understanding of Platonic theology, Platonic
Yep.
metaphysics, how my brain's like, oh no, now I have to rethink everything about Heidegger. And I don't even know what
Sure,
to
but the right way to think about this is almost all the moderns, everyone, Hegel, certainly Nietzsche, mostly Heidegger, are thinking about what to all of the people we're reading now is becoming, right? They're all thinking about the realm of history. They're all thinking about becoming. They're all thinking about the order of actuality, the order of events transpiring in time, and therefore off in this little cell of the creation from the standpoint of what these guys are thinking about. Now, from the standpoint of someone like Nietzsche, these people are thinking about the eternal order of the eternal ideas and these highfalutin things because they're trying to find some stable standard of things. And when they find one, which they're going to make up, by the way, and project, they're not going to sign their bills, and they're not going to claim that they're the ones who found it. They're going to claim that it was there beforehand and that they just discovered it in the nature of things, right? That's what the becoming people are going to say about the being people. They're going to say that the becoming people are going to say the being people are really becoming people, just like us, because we're all becoming people, but they claim to be being people because they don't want to admit that their being standard is just a becoming standard that they have eternalized, right? The will to power is the will to eternalize a temporary power relation, says Nietzsche, right? So that's the way he's going to read all of these people, is their will to eternalize is just a way of trying to anchor in the heavens some interpretation of the world that they have arrived at for their own personal psychological reasons, which are all, because personal and psychological, are going to be fully in time reasons, fully becoming reasons, not eternal reasons, right? From that point of view, the Nietzschean position is that these people only think they have contact with eternal truth, right? The reality is their mind that's having contact with what it thinks is eternal truth, because it's a finite meat body with drives and needs, et cetera, is only having contact with its drives and needs, right? Okay, that's not what any of the Platonists here think. The Platonists here think that they can understand eternal bones of being by rationally thinking about these concepts. And they may or may not be right about that, but that's what they think that they're doing. They don't think that they're just legislating. They think that they're figuring out truths about the world. Now, among the truths that they think they're figuring out about the world is how unknowable parts of the world are and how limited their mind is and all those sorts of things. A lot of these things are not positive. Nietzsche is always presenting these truths as positive. Here, many of them are negative. They're about the unknowability of something, right? So that's a place where you have to ask if the later becoming philosophers' appreciation of these people is or isn't an accurate characterization of them. If you're going to just, if you're going to argue against a position, you better steelman it, not strawman it. Does Nietzsche steelman these guys, or does he strawman these guys? Does that help?
Yeah. And then I'm wondering, well, yeah, Nietzsche got kind of spanked after that, I guess, in my mind, just because of that. When we were working on Heidegger's Being in Time, and I know for a long time what was hanging is that he thought that the metaphysics was just an era that had ended, and that now we have a new concept or a new way of understanding it. And I've been thinking about phenomenology of spirit and the Hegelian idea about not only the collective and your identity in a collective, but also as history being
Yes.
revealed. So I
Yes.
don't know.
And
like, which-
and from
but, like,
Hegel's point of view, right? The fact that all of this history goes through all of these changes, and you've got all these different variety of positions taken, but they all start converging on a stream. Yeah, the rivers start converging into a stream, right? Means that there's a direction to all this history. There's a logic to these development of these ideas, and there's a place that it's going to come out, right? And that place that it's going to come out, has a sense to it, which is not just sound and fury signifying nothing, but it had to come out there, right? And that's the way Hegel would read all this. Hegel would read all this as this is a stage in the development of human consciousness that has to go pass through these ideas to arrive at the grander synthesis it's heading towards, which little just aside, it's going to culminate in him in Berlin. But the point is, he sees the eminent logic in all this stuff that we're reasoning out here of, look, all these different positions that were tried. Of course, every position was tried. That's Hegel's position, right? Every position had to be tried, but the ones that succeeded and assimilated it all and made it into something is where that stage of human consciousness had to logically go. So it did, right? And he doesn't think this history is riddled with error. He thinks this history is riddled with necessity. And he thinks also that because of that, if each of the changes had a necessary logic to it, you don't have to wring down all the changes. You can rely on him to wring down all the changes for you and tell you that each of these steps were logically necessary, and you can just come out at the other end. If you know the steps are necessary, you know the endpoint is necessary, and therefore there's no reason to question where we arrived in, at the end of German idealism or something. Now, that's very convenient if you're at the end of German idealism, because it means you don't have to question any assumptions that got you there, but that's the actual story he's telling, right? That's why he's a becoming philosopher. He's telling you that even the stories about the eternal are embedded in a stream of becoming. They're just thought becoming instead of history becoming. It's not matter that's moving around, it's spirit that's moving around. That's the Hegelian story.
And I guess what the one little thing that came to my mind too, and I don't want to keep detracting from our text, but the things that have come to my mind, like,
Sure.
Okay, so
I understand. You got to wrestle. You got to get stuck on these things at least once or twice, so you never get out of them. But
all right, so with Hegel, so correct me if
Yeah.
I'm wrong here. It seems to me like now that I've read this, like he sort of took the dialectic and he's going, well, you have the part of yourself that makes an assertion, but it also has a thesis. But within yourself, you also have the antithesis, which will cancel it out and negate it. I'm wondering if he's trying to make us into little ones, like we were talking about here.
He is.
He is. I didn't know. Take that
the point is. The point is, Hegel's point is that whether or not you have that contrary within yourself or outside yourself is a question about the stage of development of your consciousness. But if it's outside yourself, it's only because it's part of the world that you're self-projected, right? And therefore, you're going to have to assimilate it eventually. And when you're done assimilating all of them, then yes, you're going to be a little one. You're going to be a Jungian original whole. You're going to be integrated. You're going to be both halves of the Tao together, and without even, and you're going to flow like water, like the Tao, without even knowing where you are. That's the endpoint that Hegel is headed towards. But what is that endpoint for Hegel? The endpoint of that for Hegel is that mankind is free, and mankind will decide what it is going to be next in the course of the formation of its public opinion, because it is sovereign on earth, something like that, right? That's his assimilated one. That's his final the final form of human consciousness, so to speak. It's free mankind doing what it lists, right? But that's yes, he is going to make not just you a little one. He's going to make human consciousness rather than your consciousness that little one, and you're going to be only a contributing part of that human consciousness. That's the
which is why Kierkegaard. Yeah, so which is
right, and Kierkegaard reacts to all that and says, "Who wants to be a little cog in the grand human consciousness? When you're an individual soul, an immortal one at that, right?" And so on, right? That's so we get to the existentialist reaction to all of that, as so assimilated to the whole history and society of mankind that it is alienated the individual from it, something like that. That's a typical
with
early
all that
reaction.
What was Heidegger doing then with? Because it seems like he keeps part of Hegelian historicism, but then he says you're responsible to make.
He's taking
the life
he's telling
live.
He's telling a different story of that history, right? One in which there is less of a final consummation in Hegel and much more of an open-ended, mysterious, unending process in which the fate of where we are going next is not determined by some grand impersonal societal process, but comes down to the thoughtful reactions of thinking individuals, right? So he's going to have that actual history be driven by Kierkegaardian freighted individual decision, right? So, but that still means he's a history philosopher. It still means he's a becoming philosopher. It's still a spirit that's becoming. It's just that the direction that spirit is becoming is now a hero's journey of a few heroic thinkers, something like that, right?
Okay. Yeah.
That's absolutely fair. That's where Heidegger comes out. That's why he thinks that there's a sort of ethics of how the individual thinker responds to the call of being, or something like that. That's his version of that personally freighted interaction of thought of thinking is it's his way of putting individual weight on something which might otherwise be a completely impersonal Hegelian historical process, right? But the difference from Hegel is he doesn't think that there's anything necessary about its outcome, right? He thinks that its outcome is mysterious, right? There's an unknowability about the future in Heidegger that there isn't in Hegel. But again, that's an intramural discussion between the being philosophers, becoming philosophers, right? The history philosophers, right? They still have a take of one form or another version of being superseded on all of this previous stuff. The Hegelian version is superseded because it's already been assimilated into the collective global mind and through history, and the Heideggerian one because the era of metaphysics is over.
Right. Now I feel like I'm Glaucon.
Asking these top level questions is definitely useful, because it's always hard when you're studying something to know, right, where does it fit in everybody else's boxes, right? But be advised, every single person we were reading there has their own version of boxes, and they can put, Hegel and Heidegger in each of their own versions of those boxes, right? There's the fact that a voice came later, the fact that a voice is more recent, the fact we studied a voice more doesn't mean that it's the end of any of these discussions, right? You do have to be able to see how each one follows all of the others, right? The fact that each one can is not, or can't, is not part of their plausibility, right? It's too ubiquitous that each one can give an explanation for each of the others for that to be a point of favor for any of them, right? It's a party trick they can all do. That's what I'm trying to say. So it is a useful intellectual exercise to do that for each of them, to think about how each of them would think about each of these. Absolutely do that. But don't think that because A has an explanation for all the others, that therefore none of the others has an explanation for A. They all do every which way.
Yeah, a couple of things I might throw in at that point. We just to go back, you got me triggered on Heraclitus. It was
Okay.
Eva Braun's book.
That's right.
The
That's
Logos
right.
of Heraclitus. We did it 5 years ago.
That's right.
But interestingly enough, the other two things I'd suggest in terms of trying to look at this is Heidegger did lectures on Parmenides, and he did lectures on Heraclitus.
Yes.
And that may be a path to look at to see what he now says in his, in the 1940s about these two, pre-Socratic philosophers to
Yep.
get a little bit more rounding of what he's doing.
Yep. I would add his very small book called Early Greek Thinking, which is just a commentary on a bunch of different fragments of these people. And in some ways that's deeper than some of the stuff you get in the actual lecture on Parmenides. The thing which is striking about the lecture on Parmenides is that he, gets to the intro of Parmenides' poem, and he never gets to any of the famous actual philosophical statements of Parmenides. He just never gets there. He gets sidetracked into talking about the Greek notion of truth, and then brings in all these other people, and Parmenides sort of leaves the building before the lecture course ends. The other place where he talks a fair amount about doctrines of Parmenides, though, is in the Sophists, because there he's talking about it's a Parmenidean stranger who's the character in the Sophists, and he's talking about the gigantomachia over being and the nature of the highest kinds. That's a place where you can get sort of more direct engagement with Parmenides' doctrine. I would say that and the early Greek thinking books are the place I go for understanding Plato on, not Plato, understanding Heidegger on both Parmenides and Heraclitus. So the thrust of your comment is correct. You should, go read those things to see what he thinks about them and think about it yourself. But just the particular works to look at early Greek thinking, look at Plato's Sophist. Plato's Parmenides is worth, no, it's not Plato, Heidegger on the Parmenides is worth thinking, but more for what it says about what he thinks about the Greek idea of truth than for what it says actually about the Parmenides. It's just he didn't get there in that lecture course. Fine comment. By the way, at some point in the future, we might want to do this Heidegger on the Sophist together. I will point out, though, that it's got, if you were bothered by the amount of untranslated Greek passages there was in this one, wait till you see that one, because he gets long passages in Greek and he doesn't translate them. Okay.
If there are no other questions,
Go.
if there are no questions, I have one on Dionysius the Areopagite.
Yes.
Given that he wrote when he did,
Yes.
and he tried to backdate to the Dionysius who had a conversation with the Apostle Paul,
Yes.
how long did it take for scholars to figure out who Dionysius the Areopagite really was and when he actually wrote?
The answer is not until the Renaissance did anyone have an inclination, and it was only conclusively proved in the 19th century. So there
That's
may have
a
been
long time.
there may have been people around his own time who weren't taken in by it or something, but if so, they left no record. The sort of methods of proving forgeries of this kind, the first person who was really good at it, I would say, was Nicholas of Cusa. And he did that for some other church documents that had similarly been backdated, like the donation of Constantine and the pseudo-Dionysian, pseudo-Isidorian decretals, right? Some of the church law things and so forth. And some of those methods that he used for that were sort of generalized and taken up by people in the Italian Renaissance. But actually applying them to Dionysius and figuring out that he was probably 5th century, it wasn't determined from those things. It was, you needed much more advanced methods of textual criticism where you could understand and date the concepts being used. You could find places where he was clearly relying on a Neoplatonic development that could be dated to the time of Proclus, for example, and from that you could determine that he had to be after Proclus. It's those sorts of methods that were really only, they were suspected in the Renaissance, but you can only turn those things into actual proof that it's got to be, later in the 19th century. Now, people already knew in the time of the Renaissance that the first recorded citing of him outside his own works was 523 AD by the Renaissance. That didn't prove that it had been earlier. You could just prove nobody else actually mentioned this book in their own book in something that wasn't, directly related to this book. The earliest was 523 AD, right? That tells you, it gives you an over, right? You know that he's not later than that, but you don't know how much earlier than that. And proving that it was, at the latest in the late 400s, didn't really happen until the 19th century. So great question.
Thank you.
And this, by the way, is one of the reasons that we love, careful scholars like this that go through the whole secondary literature, is because scholarship can do things like that for us, right? If we let it. You don't have to be a top tier philosopher if you do this careful scholarship to not only lay out these histories for us, but to help us answer textual questions like that. And definitively enough that we can put them to bed, that it's not just an open debate of was he from the 1st century, or was he from the 5th century? We just know, right? Because it's been put to bed. Okay, I'm going to give any wrap questions. Feels like we're petering out of wrap questions. I next want to talk about whether we want to do 2 more sessions or 3 more sessions. Was this too much material to take in one session, or Should we slow down, or is it okay to keep going at this rate?
This was a lot of material, and I don't want to say too much because this material all hangs together in a very nice way,
Yes.
leading up to Plotinus. I would like to look at Plotinus by himself if I could, because we're going to have probably I doubt if it'll be shorter than 3 hours, but I would like to, and then we can start make the decision about 2 more sessions or 1 more session when we finish that.
I understand. I mean, Plotinus himself is just 1 chapter, which is probably too little, but we could, my plan was if we wanted to go short, we would just do chapters 5 and 6. That's Plotinus and the other later Neoplatonists, which is primarily Proclus, honestly. So it's just Plotinus and his most famous successor in the same school. And that would be all we would do if we wanted to keep it relatively short. If we wanted to go long, we would add in Philo of Alexandria, which is a whole bunch of other stuff. But if we want to keep it short, we would just do 5 and 6 for next time. That would be from page 103 until page 191. So it's still a substantial 88 pages that way. Is that okay?
88
Sounds good.
pages. 88 pages goes all the way through both Philo and Plotinus.
No, it doesn't do Philo. It just does Plotinus and Proclus, basically. No,
Oh,
no
88 is my digestible size.
Fair enough. All right, let's plan on just chapters 5 and 6 for next time then. So the fundamental thing here is we're just going to look at Neoplatonism on negative theology. Most of it is going to be, well, the biggest part of it is going to be on Plotinus. And then after that, we're going to have Proclus, the Way of the One, and the commentary on the Parmenides, etc. So this is all this stuff. So you understand, Plotinus writes the Enneads. Enneads. He doesn't, not the Enneads, the Enneads. He writes the Enneads. He's not Virgil. He writes the Enneads, and but he doesn't publish them, right? They're published by his students, edited by his students. Porphyry is his main editor. There's a little guy in between who didn't do most of it, but Porphyry is his editor, and he's the other, large Neoplatonists around the same time, like one generation, a generation and a half after Plotinus. Proclus is considerably later. He's in the 400s. He was born in like the early 400s, and he works down to 480. So there's several centuries being covered here, and there's intervening time where the Neoplatonic tradition is developing between Plotinus and Proclus. But Plotinus is the originator of Neoplatonism, with the neo emphatically there, and Proclus is kind of its end. Proclus gets considerably more religious and mystical at times, but he's also just a very prolific writer. He writes tons. He writes in his own name. He writes, the theology of Plato, elements of theology. He writes the commentary on Plato's Parmenides. Well, some dispute whether or not he's the author of that, but he probably is, and a bunch of other things. He also writes diatribes, in the sense that he's involved in debates with John Philoponus on Aristotle and Plato and attorney of the world questions and other things like that. But Proclus purports to be the person who is synthesizing the whole Plato-Aristotle tradition of the whole pagan philosophy world at a time when Christianity is now already in the ascendant, right? And where this is now a semi-minority position, so to speak, at Athens. Within a century after Proclus, the academy at Athens will be shut down, and the philosophers will all pack themselves off to the what later becomes the Muslim world. They go to Edessa in what is Mesopotamia, because they're to get away from the Byzantine emperors, basically, and that's where they are when the Muslim conquest happens. So the point is that this pagan philosophy tradition kind of ends around the time of Proclus, in the sense there's people after him, but they're not very prominent. So that's what we're getting in chapters 5 and 6, is the positions of all the Neoplatonic philosophers over those several hundred years. We're not getting every philosopher in that tradition. We are getting the bookends of it, who are the highlights.
Yeah, that's the digestive size that I want to look at.
Sounds good. Okay, and pay special attention to Plotinus himself and his actual hierarchy, and he might remind you of some things. Certainly it's stuff that we may have seen before in Gilson a little bit. And then look, in Proclus, you even have untranslated Greek section headings. Yeah.
And what dating are we looking at?
Good question. I'm thinking the 17th of October. Can people do the 17th of October? Is that bad for Craig? It's the third Sunday. Craig, you're on
Works
mute.
for me. Works for me.
Craig, you're on mute. We can't hear you. Still on mute.
Yeah, I got a different activity on the 17th, but I'm trying to check the time to see when
Okay.
it's going to end. So
The 24th, I'm out of town. I'm actually out in Maryland then, so I could either, if we can't do the 17th, I could do the 31st, but that's actual Halloween, if people are okay with that.
Well, it doesn't make
Craig is saying no.
17.
17th or 31st, can't do 24th.
Okay, 17th, I'm busy till 3:30. So
Okay, and what about the 31st?
31st, we actually close off our cul-de-sac and set up everything right outside my
But-
yard for
And
Halloween.
earlier in the afternoon, you mean? So not
We start
okay.
setting up around 3 or 4. Yeah, so
I gotcha.
I might be
So-
able to stall until about 5, but that would be pushing it.
Well,
Well, the 10th is always an option.
10th is pretty soon. 80 pages, 2
2
weeks. I mean, I could do it, but you can tell, guys can tell me whether that's crazy to try to do 88 pages in 2 weeks.
I was
I was
trying
gonna
to
say,
count
if we're gonna
some.
wait longer, then we're gonna need to do
Mhm.
more than 88 pages. We're waiting until the end of October, I'd say, but I'd rather do the 10th too.
Let's do the 10th. Let's do the 10th.
Yeah, I'm good with the 10th. I'll
Yeah.
get
Okay.
I'll get through the pages.
All right,
So
so
we're gonna do 88. So we're gonna do 88 pages by the 10th, right?
chapters 5 and 6,
Okay,
which is 88 pages, by the 10th of October,
okay,
same time.
okay. And then we can figure out how far we're going later, okay?
I would think that we want to do Philo along with Gregory of Nyssa, and the question is whether or not we also include Augustine. I would think yes, but we can decide. But we're definitely going to have Pseudo Dionysius and Scotus Eriugena for their own session. Well, the only question is, which one does Augustine go in? I would probably put him in the earlier session, not the later session, but I think Philo is quite different from Gregory and Augustine, but Gregory and Augustine are kind of contemporaries in 2 poles of East and West in a similar time, so it makes sense to do them in the same session. Whereas Pseudo Dionysius is quite different, and he's closer to Scotus. So I would think that we want to do 10 and 11 together, and we want to do 8 and 9 together, which means we should probably do them with Philo, unless we want to have a really short session for just Philo. So I would think we're going to do 5 and 6 this time, and then the next time we'd be looking at doing 7 through 9, maybe at a longer break. And we'll do
Yeah, because
4.
I'm gonna be probably out of town on the 7th of November, which is
Yep.
quite a while after the 10th, man.
Yeah, we might have to wind up moving one of these to a Saturday or something if there's issues with every Sunday someone having a problem. I don't want to do this with leaving you guys out. You guys have been good about coming to all of them and doing all the readings and everything. We want to keep going with this group if we can. So we'll navigate things next time, but do bring all your constraints and possibilities for not just Sundays, but Saturdays if you need them for the, anytime from the 24th through the 7th, including some of the Saturdays. As I said, I'm out on the weekend of the 23rd and 24th, and the only other time I'm out is Thanksgiving week. I'm out. Although actually Thanksgiving week I might be able to do because I'm on vacation a little bit locally up in Sedona. All right. So anyway, we'll do just chapter 5 and 6 for next time. We can brainstorm more on sessions after that. Then I'll put this this session recording up on YouTube later tonight. I think we're good otherwise. Anyone have any final comments? Okay, this is good stuff so far, and look forward to see you guys next time. We'll do Neoplatonism.
Okay, very good.
See ya.